Did you know the character Sister Sonic was gonna be, and we're quoting here, a flirtatious and sexy bounty hunter? Back in 1991, Japanese studio Nihon Falcom released a game called Popful Mail for the PC-88 home computer. It was a side-scrolling action RPG starring a female bounty hunter named Mail. A few years later, rumors spread that Sega wanted to localize a Sega CD version of the game for America and replace Mail with Sonic's long-lost sister. They basically did the same thing with Puyo Puyo back then too. Sega was worried foreigners wouldn't buy it, so they rebranded it as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, just like how Nintendo turned Doki Doki Panic into Super Mario 2. Or at least that's how the story goes, but not a single screenshot has ever been seen. If you go looking for sources that Sister Sonic ever existed, the only citations are Electronic Gaming Monthly, more specifically just a couple sentences in the magazine's gossip section, later called the Rumor Mill. The rumor was that Sister Sonic would be at an upcoming toy fair, but that never happened. In fact, it was never shown anywhere at all. EGM's gossip was unsighted, with no reference to press releases, dev quotes, or even anonymous sources. So we had to wonder, was Sister Sonic ever a real thing? Or just a rumor masquerading as fact for 30 years? We've exposed fake canceled games in the past, and this looked like it was going to be another one. So we went looking through old Japanese magazines, and eventually we were able to find primary sources proving Sister Sonic did exist, but the rumors were only half true. In the November 1992 issue of Japanese magazine Beep Mega Drive, the director of Sega Falcom sits down for an interview and announces 5 games currently in development. One of them was Sister Sonic, which he says is further in development than any of their other games. And it's not just a reskin like Mean Bean Machine. Sister Sonic's gonna be a full-on remake, but she's not actually Sonic's sister. We're gonna quote him at length here. Keep in mind, Popful Mail was originally developed by Nihon Falcom, and Sega Falcom was a joint venture to bring Nihon's PC games to Sega consoles. Director Yano says, Sega Falcom does more than just port Nihon Falcom titles, but reinterprets Nihon Falcom hit series in its own Sega Falcom way. You could say we're cooking them up in a completely different form. I want to emphasize that Nihon's titles exhibit a different thought process and perspective on games. Among them is Sister Sonic, a remake of Popful Mail. This doesn't mean she's Sonic's actual sister, more like a female relative of the Sonic family. The reason for creating this new character and remaking Popful Mail is that it makes more sense for us to use Sonic, who's already popular all around the world. Sister Sonic is the game of our first 5 releases that we've made the most progress on so far. Further down the page it says, Sister Sonic is an action RPG based on Popful Mail, starring the first female Sonic character, Sister Sonic, as the main character. The protagonist being a bounty hunter hasn't changed, but Sister Sonic isn't a cute character like Mail. She's a more mature girl. Expect her to have a flirtatious and sexy charm. Of course, the story's been rewritten to fit the new characters. It has more action than the original, paired with the crisp animation and sound only possible on a CD-ROM. It'll release in Japan and overseas at nearly the same time with Japanese subtitles. So let's clear up some misinformation. We're specifically debunking Wikipedia here, but pretty much all the English language coverage of Sister Sonic makes the same claims, because they all pull from EGM's gossip. So first of all, Sister Sonic wasn't an American localization of Popful Mail. It was a remake releasing worldwide, including Japan. Second, like we said, Sister Sonic wasn't Sonic's sister. She was a sexy relative. And third, Sega wasn't trying to pass the game off as an original work. They were always upfront that it was building on top of Popful Mail's foundation. Actually, if they had tried to pass it off as an original game, it probably wouldn't have gotten cancelled. We bought this book from Japan. It says when Popful Mail fans heard their favorite game was getting transformed into Sonic, they started a mail-in campaign asking Sega to faithfully port Popful Mail to Sega CD. A vehement protest from fans, it says. They must have sent a ton of letters because Sega rolled over and did exactly that. Popful Mail for Sega CD released in Japan in 1994, and in America a year later. Even without Sonic, though, it was still a remake. Just look at the PC-88 original compared to the Sega CD version. It's virtually unrecognizable. Now that's all cleared up, you're probably wondering, would Sister Sonic have been any good? Probably yes, actually. US reviewers scored the Popful Mail remake at about 8 out of 10, and these days it pops up on a lot of Sega CD top 10 lists. It's kind of a cult classic and pretty pricey if you want to get a legit copy. In the 90s, it was praised for its visuals, cutscenes, music, which you're hearing now, and the voice acting was impressive for its time.
Most impressive, I must admit. Who are you?
I'm Male, Popful Male. Right now I'm after a dangerous magician called Muttonhead. There's a big reward for him.
Presumably, Sister Sonic would have gotten a similar reception, but even better because it's Sonic. And it probably would have taken Sonic fans another decade to get an internet connection and find out it was originally some other game. Sister Sonic could have been an interesting chapter in the canon, and the franchise's first RPG. But we'll never find out, because die-hard male fans got it cancelled.
There's been many cancelled Sonic the Hedgehog titles over the years, including big-budget main series projects, spin-offs, and even an educational game. In this video, we'll be showcasing many of them, with new and exclusive information for a handful. The first game we're talking about is the aforementioned educational title, and no, we're not talking about Sonic Schoolhouse. Founded in July 1987 by programmers Donald Campbell and John Prince, Tiertex was a Manchester-based developer best known for converting arcade titles like Strider and Street Fighter to home computers. By 1990, the company made a name for itself by being the first developer in the United Kingdom to work on the Sega Master System, a hugely popular console in Europe. Because of this notoriety, Jeff Brown, who founded the publisher US Gold, contracted Tiertex to develop a seemingly unlikely title, an educational game for the Master System starring none other than Sonic the Hedgehog. Brown had a good connection with the then president and CEO of Sega, Hayao Nakayama, and had full permission to use Sonic's likeness in an educational game. The title that ultimately came from this was Sonic's EduSoft. Based on a series of Atari 800 games developed by Brown in the late 80s, Word Olympics and Maths for Fun, Sonic's EduSoft has the player, as Sonic, competing against Robotnik's Badniks in a series of word and math problems. Besides these levels, 3 minigames are also available. One where players pop balloons, one where they try to stay on a trampoline, and one where they avoid garbage on the ground. Keep in mind that the game was developed before Sonic the Hedgehog 2, so Tiertex didn't have much to draw from. One of the members of EduSoft's small development team was programmer Jez Sherlock, who told Did You Know Gaming a little more about the game's production. According to Sherlock, EduSoft was completed as intended, but looking back at it, I realize how far from release it was. All the concepts and features were there, but things like the minigames make me cringe. I was asked to put things in that used single-button controls, so it could be more simple for younger kids. They should have been better, even with the constraints. The exact reason for EduSoft's cancellation is unknown, but it's theorized that Sega believed the game would be unprofitable, and thus scrapped the project. A prototype ROM of the game was released in 2008, and the game has been available to download ever since. Another offbeat canned Sonic game is Treasure Tales, an Aztec-themed puzzle game starring the Blue Blur sidekick Miles Tails Prower. In late 1992, Sega began looking for Sonic titles that could be completed and shipped in time for the next year's Christmas. This was because it became apparent that Sonic the Hedgehog 3 would not be completed in time for said holidays. The head of the American Sega Technical Institute at the time, Roger Hector, suggested the game should be a spin-off starring Tails rather than Sonic. Hector quickly assigned 4 developers at STI to come up with an idea for the game. Among these devs was artist Craig Stitt, who we were thankfully able to get in touch with. Stitt told Did You Know Gaming, I pitched a puzzle/adventure idea entitled Treasure Tales to the team, but no one understood what I was suggesting. So I went back to my desk and did a quick mock-up of the isometric game I had been trying to describe and took that to the next meeting. Once everyone understood what I was suggesting, it was decided that would be the direction we took the game. I still don't remember exactly how far along Treasure Tales got. We must have gotten to some kind of first playable or proof of concept, but the screenshots I have were the ones I mocked up to show Sega. I remember doing the artwork for the levels seen in the mock-up screens, as well as animating the springboards and talking with programmers Ken Rose and Earl Stratton about the best way to animate the flames. According to Stitt, Treasure Tales got cancelled in February 1993, as STI was not large enough to be working on 5 games simultaneously: Sonic 3, Sonic Spinball, Treasure Tales, and 2 other cancelled projects, Spinny and Spike and Jester. All that currently remains of the title are a few mock-up screens found on Stitt's resume from 1995. A few months after Treasure Tales' cancellation, Stitt would take another stab at a Sonic spin-off game. Pitched as Segapede, this game was a high-speed platformer starring a microscopic badnik named Zip. The game reused artwork from Hidden Palace Zone, a scrapped level in Sonic 2 that Stitt had done the art for. They did this to help save time during development. While Sega approved the pitch, they did not want it to be part of the Sonic universe, so they changed the name to Astropede. Astropede would spend 14 months in development, but was cancelled in 1994 due to a lack of resources. Stitt believes he has a prototype cartridge of the game somewhere in storage, but has yet to find it as of this video. Stitt wasn't the only developer at STI who tried to pitch their own Sonic game. Shortly after the release of Sonic Spinball in November 1993, Peter Morathiat, a veteran game designer best known as the creator of Comic Zone, pitched a tie-in game for Sonic's upcoming SatAM series on ABC. Codenamed Sonic 16, the game was much different from the usual Sonic experience, going much slower and relying on stealth rather than speed. After spending a few days on an Amiga computer, Morathiat and artist John Duggan created a brief demo to show what the game could have been. A video of this demo has thankfully been preserved online by Morathiat himself, which has Sonic sneaking through the city of Robotropolis as he attacks enemies by throwing rings and shooting quills at them. Sonic 16 would eventually make its way to Sonic's co-creator, Yuji Naka, who was not a fan. As Morathiat explains in a 2007 interview with Sega 16, it wasn't easy to animate fast-scrolling backgrounds in the Amiga art program Brilliance, so the demo came off too slow-paced, though I always intended for it to have some fast-moving sections. From what I heard, Yuji Naka gave the design thumbs down, but it was probably the right decision. The cartoon wasn't even out, so banking on its success would have been premature, and too many spin-offs for a fresh new franchise are likely to do more harm than good. STI would make another attempt for a Sonic SatAM game a year later, this time for the upcoming 32X add-on. The game was called Sonic Mars, named after the 32X's codename, and was pitched to Sega by Michael Kosaka, who'd previously worked as a designer at EA and Atari. As we can read from a document dated May 17, 1994, the game had Sonic being sent to a virtual world to rescue his friends from Dr. Robotnik. Once there, Sonic must travel through worlds like Icebreaker Zone, Dreamweave Zone, and Fat Tuesday Zone, which featured a Mardi Gras-themed Robotnik named Banetic, who would throw barrels and necklaces at the player. Shortly after the game began production in mid-1995, Kosaka would leave Sega due to internal disputes between him and STI producer Dean Lester. Around this time, the SatAM elements got dropped, and development shifted to the upcoming Sega Saturn. This was the start of Sonic X-treme, probably the most infamous Sonic game that was never released.
The 90s was a golden age of gaming, a simpler time. But for the people making those games, it was far from simple. The transition to 3D was uncharted territory, studios were rampant with office politics, and as a result, a lot of projects never crossed the finish line. So today we're going to take a look at what these cancelled games were, and also why they died, if they would have been any good, and the lengths fans have gone to find what's left of them. From a Half-Life getting scrapped because one executive was high maintenance, a civil war between Mega Man fans costing them a priceless auction, to Sega losing out on a literal $1 trillion. These are the biggest lost games of the 90s.
What do you mean you couldn't catch him?
Guy's fast as lightning, boss. He just disappeared in a blue streak. I'm telling you, he's bigger and badder than before.
Sega.
Generally considered the best game on the Genesis, Sonic 2 was developed by Sega Technical Institute, a California super studio that combined the talents of Japanese and US devs under one roof. But cultural differences mounted, and long story short, the two sides broke up as soon as it was finished. After making a few games separately, the Japanese flew home to make Nights into Dreams, which would end up a critical and commercial success. Meanwhile, the Americans were tasked with developing the first 3D Sonic game, and it was one of the most hellish experiences you could ever imagine. Sonic X-treme was originally supposed to be a 1994 launch title for 32X, but they missed the deadline, and the 32X flopped anyway, so development shifted to the Sega Saturn. This was around the time PlayStation launched, and its success got Sega executives finger-pointing and infighting. At one point, Sega of America made a cartridge-based console they called a Saturn killer, which is wild to think about. Just imagine Nintendo of America trying to make an N64 killer. But anyway, X-treme's development was now moved on to that system. But when they plugged in the system prototype, it wouldn't even start, so they scrapped it and moved back to the Saturn. And all of this back and forth was just a waste of time they could not afford, because now they had a hard deadline of Christmas 1996. Not only were they constantly changing platforms, but also game engines, meaning a lot of work had to start over from scratch. To make matters worse, the team was deeply understaffed, and people kept rage quitting from poor working conditions. Eventually, they went to management and said, "Get rid of the political crap, isolate a core team, and give us the tools necessary to get the job done." After that, 10 devs moved into an empty office building and worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. As for the game itself, it took a lot of forms over 2 years of development hell, but at this point the focus was speed, exploration, and secret areas. Unfortunately, going fast meant falling into pits and hitting walls when they suddenly would come on screen, so devs had to widen the view with a fisheye lens. As for the game's story, Sonic would collect 6 rings of power and take down Dr. Robotnik, with help from new characters like Tiara Bubowski. Sonic X-treme was announced at E3 1996 to thunderous applause. A playable demo was erected at the front of Sega's booth, and magazines predicted an epic showdown with Mario 64 later that year. Management threw a party, with the Hedgehog himself handing out Sonic tattoos, and Sega of America's president proclaiming Saturn would win the console war come Christmas time. And they even showed the trailer that you saw earlier, where Mario's really afraid of Sonic. Despite their bravado and the press's initial enthusiasm, people quickly caught onto a lot of X-treme's problems. The fisheye lens was disorienting, levels were empty, and it just looked a bit jank. Meanwhile, the devs were working themselves sick. Programmer Christina Coffin came down with walking pneumonia and had to bow out. Designer Chris Sen lost 25 pounds and was told that he had 6 months to live. But finishing X-treme was impossible without them, so that was the last straw, and the game was cancelled a few months before Christmas. There was even going to be a theatrical movie tie-in, but that got cancelled as well. It was too late to stop all of the merchandise from reaching the store shelves though, and promos were glued onto ice cream trucks for over a decade. Sonic X-treme has lived on in legend ever since as the most famous cancelled Sonic game. So, would it have been any good? Builds have leaked over the years, but even if it was finished, it probably wouldn't have rivaled Mario. But who knows, maybe in an alternate reality where the team were allowed to do their jobs, it could have been something special. Chris Sen survived his 6-month diagnosis and put it more succinctly than we can. Quote, "Sonic X-treme underwent many changes and difficulties that would have tested even the most seasoned game industry veterans. Lack of experience, poor business decisions, ego, politics, overambition, bad timing, and poor communication, which ultimately spelled disaster for the game." And here's the tragic cherry on top. Remember the Saturn killer? Sega gave Nvidia $5 million to make it, and by all rights, should have gotten their money back when it didn't work. But Nvidia's president asked if he could keep the money, and in exchange, give Sega part ownership of his company. Sega took the deal and then cashed out a few years later at a decent profit. But if they didn't cash out, they would have enough money to buy out Nintendo and Sony. That guy's still president today, actually.
If he would have kept that the investment, I think it'd be worth probably about $1 trillion today.
Nowadays, they're the most valuable company in the world, and Nvidia chips power Nintendo consoles today. Ouch. That is Mario 128, a completely different project from 64's direct sequel. Miyamoto called both of them Mario 128, which caused a lot of confusion. But sometimes he called the sequel Mario 64 too, and that's the game we're going to talk about. Around the same time Sonic X-treme was getting cancelled, the Plumber's Jump to 3D was hitting store shelves and winning awards everywhere. Miyamoto wanted to make a quick follow-up as the final game that he would direct personally. Quote, "I couldn't put everything into Super Mario 64 that I really wanted, so we've decided to continue working toward a sequel which will take about 1.5 years at least. Mario 64 only used about 60% of the Nintendo 64's power. There's a lot more we could have done, but we ran out of time and cartridge space, so we're gonna do those things in the next one." Luigi got cut from the original, and bringing him back was a core focus for this sequel. Not for multiplayer though. Instead, it would be more like Resident Evil 0, where one player controls both characters using their skill sets and solving puzzles. Except for a post-game cameo, Yoshi also got cut from the first game, and Japanese magazines reported that he would return in a more prominent role, though Miyamoto never confirmed that detail. "I'm changing the gameplay system, adding more enemies and retooling the display and graphics," he teased. "Last time, I only designed for a cartridge, but next time I would take advantage of the potential of the 64DD. I plan to utilize the 64DD's read and write functions to create a new type of game." In 1998, he said the sequel was half finished, and a prototype with Mario and Luigi running around was sitting on his desk, but he was too busy with Zelda to make time for it. Ocarina was massively delayed, but he promised as soon as it was finished, he'd turn attention back to Mario. In the meantime, his team was experimenting with 4-player split screen, and insiders reported the other 2 characters were Peach and Toad, just as they had been in Super Mario Bros. 2. But it was a chaotic time for Nintendo, with the 64DD getting repeatedly delayed before ultimately flopping. Satellaview and the Nintendo Power System were sucking up resources as well, and then they flopped too. Virtual Boy, Game Boy, the mobile system GB, Nintendo just had too many irons in the fire. Miyamoto was overloaded too, producing a dozen games at once and having to move developers back and forth between them like a game of whack-a-mole. A lot of them got delayed, while others never came out at all. 64-2's cancellation was never formally announced, but it faded around the same time Mario 128 got revealed. It kinda had the same name, so a lot of people thought it was just the same game. Miyamoto teased it might be a GameCube pack-in title, but that didn't end up happening either. The press kept hounding him for updates until he finally put the questions to rest in 2007 with this explanation.
When people ask me what happened to Mario 128, I'm always at a loss as to how to answer. Because actually most of you have already played it. But you played it in a game called Pikmin.
Basically, he said Mario 128's 100 on-screen characters became Pikmin, and its spherical stage turned into Mario Galaxy's planets. No one asked him for updates ever again, but he was talking about 128, not 64-2. Those questions were never answered. Maybe some ideas made it into 64DS or 3D World, but who knows? Maybe it didn't become much of anything. It's really hard to say for certain, since no footage or screenshots were ever made public. Obviously it would have been good, and fans hope that someday that a half-finished prototype from Miyamoto's desk may leak online. But if it hasn't by now, after 25 years and all of the Giga leaks, it probably never will. In 1993, Capcom took Mega Man's gameplay, mixed in a little Metroid, and introduced a new protagonist set in a dark future, resulting in Mega Man X, often considered one of the best Super Nintendo games ever made. After a couple of direct sequels, Capcom started working on a spin-off that would never see the light of day. No one knew it existed until 2018, when franchise archivist ProtoDude found design documents on Yahoo Auctions Japan with an opening bid of $1,000. He'd bid on the proto carts before, but this was for a game that no one had even heard of. Translating the auction photos revealed the title as Mega Man X Interactive. It was dated 1995 to 96, starred classic characters and new ones, and had hours of cutscenes, interspersed with gameplay and dialogue options that send you down branching paths. In the 90s, people would have called it an interactive movie game, hence the game's title. ProtoDude asked fans to pull resources so he could buy the full 11 pages, have them translated, and donated to the Video Game History Foundation. They raised over 10 grand in a day, and ProtoDude placed his bid.
Unfortunately, because I made that public, someone pretty high up in the Japanese Mega Man community saw it, so they reported the auction. And it had an hour to go, still no bids, and within that hour, it was pulled. It was gone, completely gone.
Japanese fans applauded the takedown. They believed making the documents public would be disrespectful to Capcom, and suspected that they might have been stolen. Maybe from the dumpster behind Capcom's office, or an external storage unit, or a developer swiped it themselves. ProtoDude thinks they weren't stolen, and the seller might have just been a developer's relative, because they were also selling jewelry and antiques. It's possible that this stuff was their inheritance. He told us that once a year he continues reaching out to try and make a deal in private, but to no avail. This whole debacle caused a breakup between Western and Japanese Mega Man fans, and to this day, you can find them on Yahoo Auctions, bidding against each other. If the West wins, they dump it online. If Japan wins, they stick it in a private collection.
There is a bit of a cultural difference in terms of, it belongs in a museum versus it belongs with the right holder. So that schism still very much exists.
Proto-Dude talked to a Capcom dev who confirmed Interactive was real, but couldn't remember why it was cancelled. They also said it influenced the development of Super Adventure Mega Man, a movie game that released in Japan a couple of years later for PlayStation and Saturn. Interactive was presumably meant for those systems as well, since hours of cutscenes weren't possible on cartridge consoles. So, would Mega Man X Interactive have been any good? It's hard to say, but Famitsu reviewed Super Adventure 7 out of 10, with praise for its animation and voice acting, but points off for plot and limited gameplay. Interactive likely would have been similar, a decent game for its time, but not a masterpiece. For modern fans, the real draw is the characters and lore it would have added to the franchise. Hopefully, it'll resurface someday. Look at any NES Top 100 list and you'll find the Castlevania trilogy all near the top. The same goes for the sequels on Super Nintendo, Genesis, and PlayStation. So people were excited in 1998 when they heard rumors of Castlevania 3D coming to Dreamcast. But the hype cooled when they learned that Konami Japan wasn't making it. Instead, it was Konami of America, whose recent titles reviewed in the 7s. Even more concerning was the anonymous insiders who trashed the project and called it Cancelvania, implying that it was a train wreck that would never come out. But Konami shut them up and showed up to the next E3 with an impressive demo. Now titled Castlevania Resurrection, fans were relieved to learn its director was Norio Takamoto, a designer on the excellent Castlevania Bloodlines, who worshipped Symphony of the Night. He was axing Castlevania 64's puzzles and fetch quests and going back to what made the series great to begin with, jump and whippin' action. He told reporters, think of it as a 3D version of the very first Castlevania. Instead of wandering around courtyards, you'd be whipping your way through 50 linear stages. The story was set in 1666, with Victor and Sonia Belmont as its two playable characters. It would run at 60 frames per second, and the music was ambient and gothic, just as it should be. Outlets got a 25% complete build later that year, with GameSpot saying after the disappointment of Castlevania 64, this could be the series' true transition to 3D. IGN loved what they played and called it incredible, with potential to be the series' own Super Mario 64. They had concerns about the camera, but the game was still far from complete, so hopefully the wrinkles would get ironed out before launch. Unfortunately though, Dreamcasts weren't exactly flying off of the shelves, so the day that Sony revealed the PS2's launch date, Konami cancelled all of their Dreamcast projects, including Resurrection. Its memory lived on for decades, with fans obsessing and documenting every detail. It was the one that got away, their own Euro Zelda. Until, in 2021, a burner account posted video of a long-lost disc and threw it up on eBay. Bids shot past 20 grand, as fans worried it would fall into the hands of a hoarder. But then, just like with Mega Man Interactive, the auction disappeared. Fortunately, there was a happy ending this time, as Dreamcast preservationist Komi Laron managed to acquire it from the seller and dump it online. Fans made box art that you can print yourself, so you can add Resurrection to your shelf, play it on original hardware, or just run an emulator. We talked to Komi for some previously unknown behind the scenes. Long story short, he was in contact with the seller, who's a die-hard Castlevania collector, before it went public, and Komi offered as much as he could. It was a modest sum compared to its worth though, so the collector decided to sell it on eBay for a higher price, while promising Komi the ROM for preservation's sake. But his auction got flooded with fake bids and nasty messages from die-hard fans, so he cancelled it, had a laugh about it with Komi, and sold it to him for his original modest offer. A bunch of YouTubers ran the story with half the details wrong, didn't credit Comey, and some amateur sites falsely took the credit for the dump. It was a bad time all around, but he did get the disc. So, was it any good? Honestly, it's pretty rough. A lot of fans were disappointed, but to be clear, this was the E3 build, which was really more of a tech demo. The camera is bad and the levels are unfinished, because at this early stage, the main purpose was to look good in magazine screenshots. Development continued for another 10 months after that, but so far, those later builds still haven't been found. Resurrection devs would later claim the early rumors about Castlevania being garbage came from insiders with an agenda. Believe whoever you want, but I think it's fair to say that it definitely had a chance at being great. For whatever it's worth, the next Castlevania game reviewed 8 out of 10. It was made by a different studio in Japan though, as the Resurrection team disbanded after it got cancelled. Probably the 90s most famous cancelled game, Ura Zelda was a 64 disk drive expansion to Ocarina of Time that promised new areas, dungeons, minigames, and even more. Miyamoto likened it to Zelda 1's New Game Plus, which boasted higher difficulty with a remixed heart container, shop, item, dungeon locations, and so on. Zelda 1's New Game Plus doesn't have an in-game title. Western fans call it Second Quest, but in Japan it's often referred to as Ura Zelda, which translates to Another Zelda, or Zelda's flip side. And that's what this new Ura was gonna be, a continuation of that old tradition, but more ambitious. Miyamoto said there'd also be, quote, the random element. Every time you go in a dungeon, the composition will be different. For example, if a treasure chest was in a certain place the first time you entered a dungeon, it won't be there next time, it'll be somewhere else. We wouldn't be able to design our own dungeons, but we could, quote, download new dungeons and share data with other players. Potentially hundreds of dungeons, he said. In another interview, he teased, we've already talked about a network Zelda as an interesting idea. The assistance of other players in the network could motivate a player's active participation instead of the traps or secrets that I create. We asked Giles Goddard, an Ocarina dev sitting next to Miyamoto in that interview, if they actually worked on those network features, and what were they?
Instead of the traps or secrets that I create. Do you recall any specifics regarding work on this network Zelda that have never made their way into a finished Zelda game?
Yes.
Okay.
And I want to stay alive, so I'm not going to say what.
Unfortunately, those features are still a secret. During the last 2 years of Ocarina of Time's development, Miyamoto teased a lot of ideas for its expansion, but eventually narrowed the scope down to just remixed dungeons. But director Aonuma didn't want to do it, as he didn't think it could properly be called a new game. So a bargain was struck. A skeleton crew would keep making Ura, while the rest of the team developed a full sequel, under the condition that they only had 1 year to do it. Miyamoto told the press he was serious, and if Aonuma couldn't hit the deadline, he'd cancel the sequel. Luckily, they managed to pull it off, and Majora's Mask released in early 2000. Miyamoto announced soon after that, Ura Zelda was finished, and since the 64DD flopped, maybe he would sell it as a $20 cartridge. But the Nintendo 64 generation was coming to a close, so he kinda didn't know what to do with it. A couple of years later, GameCube was struggling, so they decided to give it away as a pre-order bonus for Wind Waker to help boost sales. In English, it's Master Quest, but in Japanese, it's still called Ura. After all of those years waiting though, a lot of fans were disappointed. This was even less ambitious than Zelda 1's Ura. Where was the randomization, downloadable dungeons, and network features? Many were convinced the real Ura was locked away in a vault somewhere. In reality though, most of its grand ideas just never got developed, and this was all that remained. A decade later, Ocarina got remade for the 3DS.
知る人ぞ知るもう一つの時のオカリナ、通称ウラゼルダ。
This was closer to the original vision. The entire game was flipped left to right, enemies dealt double damage, a new boss rush, and of course, remixed dungeons. It was a nice second quest, but still couldn't live up to the promises and hype of the original, the legendary Ura Zelda.
I have recommended your services to my employers, and they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential.
In 1998, the only game that won more Game of the Year awards than Ocarina of Time was Half-Life. It had the atmosphere, cutscenes woven into gameplay, and a story worthy of an RPG. On PC, it broke records and sold 10 million copies, leading the entire genre to reshape itself in Half-Life's image, from the shooting galleries of old to the immersive worlds of today. You play as a Black Mesa scientist the day an experiment goes haywire and opens a rift to another dimension. Aliens pour in, followed by the US government rushing to cover it up and kill the witnesses, including you. A couple of sequel expansions followed, each telling the same story from a different perspective, a US Marine and a security guard. But in 1999, one more game was in development called Hostile Takeover, where you'd play as a junior G-man in training under the watchful eye of the interdimensional bureaucrat himself. Wearing the same suit, trying to work your way up the corporate ladder, that kind of thing. The story started in an underground mining facility called Allied Processing, where workers portal to other dimensions, grab some minerals, and then teleport back to ship them to Black Mesa. When the science experiment goes south, all the miners start burning the evidence, as they know the government's coming to seize control, hence, the game was called Hostile Takeover. Together with Allied Processing security forces, you'd have to fight your way above ground, past aliens, head crab-infected monkeys, and other new enemy types. After escaping to the surface, the military would arrive and you'd have to shoot your way out. All along, G-Man observes you from afar, till near the very end, where he'd then nuke the facility. The other expansions were made by Gearbox, but this one was developed by 2015 Inc., with Valve writing the story. The game was 60% finished, then one day, Valve sent a note saying it was cancelled. We talked to Benson Russell, one of Hostile Takeover's core designers.
Everyone was pissed. I was a co-owner of the company and I got called in and they handed the note to me. I read it and I was like, what the f*** is this? Like, why? We're making good progress. We have all these good things to show. Like, we don't understand. Like, why is this? It was a big mystery to the company in that regard. And then later on, talking with other people and realizing it's like, oh, okay, yeah, now it makes sense.
Long story short, 2015's CEO was a bit of a control freak and was just plain difficult to work with. Valve head Gabe Newell didn't want to put up with the drama anymore and pulled the plug so he'd never have to see him again. But was the game going to be any good? 2015's previous work was well received, and after all of this went down, a lot of the devs were fed up with their boss as well. So they quit and formed their own studio, Infinity Ward, where they made the first Call of Duty, which reviewed better than the Half-Life expansions that did come out, leading to them making a dozen sequels. In other words, yes, Hostile Takeover would have been pretty good. Benson said if it sold well, they might have made more Half-Life expansions, so it seems an entire branch of the franchise got aborted just because one executive was completely insufferable. As of this video's publication, Hostile Takeover hasn't leaked online, but maybe someday. We've got a feeling about this one.
Did you know? There's been dozens of unreleased games throughout history that have since been recovered and preserved online. There are thousands of unreleased games out there, and sometimes a nearly finished prototype emerges. Or if we're lucky, the actual source code of a game gets found on an old surviving disc. In this video, we'll be looking at several canned games, looking at why they were never released and how they got discovered and where they are now. Look out for some exclusive information in this video, as there will be plenty of it from our talks with game developers, collectors, and fellow historians.
Let's start off with one of the most infamous cancelled games in history, Star Fox 2. Star Fox 2 is a rare example of a cancelled project that eventually got an official release. After years of various builds getting leaked online, Nintendo announced the finished game would be bundled with their then upcoming Super NES Classic Edition. Like its predecessor, Star Fox 2 was co-developed by Nintendo EAD in Japan and Britain's Argonaut Software, who had formed a tight bond since their connection in the early 90s. The company originally had a 3-title deal with Nintendo, where they had to develop games using their high-tech Super FX chip. The original Star Fox was one of these games. Two British programmers from Argonaut, Giles Goddard and Dylan Cuthbert, were sent back to Japan and split off, with Goddard working on stunt race effects, while Cuthbert led development on the sequel to Star Fox. The development of Star Fox 2 started right after the first game was finished. According to leaked snippets of the game's source code, programming began on February 16, 1993, 5 days before Star Fox was released in Japan. Cuthbert would serve as the lead programmer on the project, with 2 Nintendo EAD coders working under him. It was a small team of people overseen by Shigeru Miyamoto and director Katsuya Eguchi. Cuthbert recalls living in Kyoto during the production of Star Fox 2, having limited contact with Argonaut or the outside world in general. Both technically and in design, Star Fox 2 was a much more complex game than the original. It was decided early on that the title should use more powerful hardware, and with extra memory, the game could go beyond the on-rails shooter and give the player the ability to soar in any direction. It took months of planning to decide what Star Fox 2 would be. At first, it was literally up in the air. Eguchi wanted a more roguelike game set deep in the darkest corners of space, heavily inspired by a Famicom game called Starluster. While researching the game's overall feel, Cuthbert tinkered with the R-Wing's ability to transform and developed a 3D platforming prototype. It was then decided this was the way to go. The sequel would be half strategic space shooter and half low-ground dungeon crawler. Shigeru Miyamoto considered the original Star Fox an experimental platform, so it was natural that the next game would feature many new ideas that pushed the SNES to its limits. Star Fox 2's story takes place right after the events of the first game. The main antagonist, Andross, returns to invade the army of Corneria, and it's up to Team Star Fox to save the day. Falco, Fox, Peppy, Slippy, and 2 fresh female companions. On their way, the group encounters many evil entities throughout space. Most notably, they meet Team Starwolf, the evil counterpart to Team Star Fox. Star Fox 2 would include a plethora of new characters. In addition to the wicked Starwolf team, there were 2 new playable heroes, Miyu, a courageous lynx, and Faye, a little white poodle. There were plenty of other ideas for the updated Star Fox team. Looking at leaked sprite sheets, we can see designs for all sorts of creatures that could have made it into the game. There were gazelles, bison, bears, sheep, lemurs, dogs, pigs, rabbits, robots, and, interestingly, African-American women. Were this in the final product, it would have been the first human character to appear in a Star Fox game, and one of the earliest examples of black representation in a Nintendo title. The exact name of this character, if they ever had one, is unknown, and Dylan Cuthbert has no memory of their creation. Star Fox 2 made its public debut at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 1995. Nintendo spent most of its time at the show promoting upcoming Super FX games, with Star Fox 2 as the top title. Coverage was mostly positive, with the game making the front cover of several magazines. It was clear that people were ready for more Star Fox. Star Fox 2 was finished by mid-1995 and was planned for release in August. However, at the end of development, it became apparent that 3D technology was advancing far quicker than anyone at Nintendo could have imagined. Star Fox 2 would look obsolete only months after its release. Nintendo didn't want to risk this and decided to scrap the project last minute. In a 2015 talk with Nintendo Life, Cuthbert recalls, "It was the summer of 1995, and the PlayStation and Saturn were suddenly doing very well in Japan. I think that caught Nintendo off guard. The decision was made because they didn't want the old Gen 3D going up against the much better 3D of the next generation side by side. The game was about 95% complete. Even after the decision was made, Argonaut went ahead and completed it, taking it to be fully QA'd through Nintendo's testing subsidiary Mario Club. Nintendo decided to focus on titles for the upcoming Nintendo 64, including a new Star Fox game which began production right after Star Fox 2 was cancelled. You can see many elements of Star Fox 2 in Star Fox 64, such as Team Starwolf and all-range mode battles. Cuthbert would leave Argonaut for Sony, as their contract with Nintendo was up. He couldn't stay in Kyoto due to a non-poaching agreement after Giles Goddard quit Argonaut to work for Nintendo EAD. Both Nintendo and Cuthbert would keep final copies of Star Fox 2 in their archives as a memento of a project they spent 2 years on, only for nobody to see it. Star Fox 2 leaking to the internet was inevitable. At the CES show in 1995, an Arizona man named Sean J. Freeman was arrested for attempting to steal a copy of Star Fox 2. Freeman, who was charged with felony petty theft, allegedly planned to pirate the game. He was caught in the middle of the show floor and tackled by Las Vegas police. With the rise of emulation in the late 90s, there was more interest in finding lost games that were never released. Sometime in 1999, an early alpha leaked onto ROM sites. This version contains numerous bugs and consists of debug menus and a broken multiplayer mode. Not the ideal way to play the holy grail of lost Nintendo games. Another prototype leaked onto a German fan translations site in August 2002. It was a Japanese build much further along that was eventually discovered to be a near-final prototype dated June 1995. This version originated from an assembled binary kept by an anonymous Argonaut developer. Cuthbert denies being the person who released this ROM and suspects they were stolen from his hard drive after he went to Sony. Whoever the culprit was, they brought Star Fox 2 to the internet, and we thank them for it. The story was over. At least, it was until 2017 when Nintendo announced the SNES Classic. The dedicated console would include 21 pre-installed games, one of which being the final build of Star Fox 2. 20 years after it got cancelled, the game was finally released. It even got a new box art drawn by Takaya Imamura, Star Fox's original character designer. The announcement shocked everyone, including Dylan Cuthbert, who programmed the title over 2 decades ago. As Cuthbert told GamesIndustry.biz, "I didn't know about it at all. My company does not have any work with Nintendo right now, so there wouldn't have been an NDA-safe way of letting me know anyway. On the other hand, I got to have a big awesome surprise like everyone else, so I'm quite happy about that. It's an absolutely awesome feeling. Incredible, really. Perhaps a first in the games industry even." The decision to include Star Fox 2 in the SNES Classic came from one of Nintendo's producers, who thought it was a waste not to release it in the world. It was known for years that Nintendo had a master build of the ROM. It was even used when Dylan Cuthbert worked on Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS, with them giving him the file for research. Nintendo has a dense archive which can be seen in the infamous 4chan GigaLeak, where tons of material from the company's history, including Star Fox 2 ROMs and source code, were spread online in 2020.
Our next story is not only about a lost game, but also a lost piece of hardware for one of the most iconic consoles of the 1990s. In 1993, when virtual reality was a hot new thing, Sega unveiled a home VR product for the Genesis, the aptly named Sega VR. The add-on was shown at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show with 2 LED screens, a high-functioning IMU, and a ludicrously low price for the time of $200. For comparison, a basic VR kit in 1991 would typically cost over $250,000 when considering stuff like the graphics supercomputer and positional tracking equipment. The low recommended retail price was made possible due to Sega's partnership with Silicon Valley startup Ono Sendai. Ono Sendai was founded by entrepreneur Mark Pesky in July 1991 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with the company starting in earnest in San Francisco, November 1991. Pesky had worked in virtual reality since the late 80s and was well aware of the potential it had, and their patented tracking solution used in the Sega VR could be manufactured for only $1. When the Sega VR debuted at SCES 1993, 4 compatible games were shown with it. There was Iron Hammer, a tank combat game by Novalogic, Outlaw Racing, a simple racing title, Matrix Runner, a Snatcher-inspired murder mystery, and Nuclear Rush, a high-speed cyberspace adventure intended as a pack-in game. Nuclear Rush was the brainchild of Futurescape Productions, a small California company founded in October 1992 by ex-EA programmers Kenneth Hurley and Kevin McGrath. Sega of America producer Jesse Taylor, who'd worked with Hurley and McGrath at EA, recommended their new startup to the then president and CEO, Tom Kalinske. Kalinske was impressed with the team's resume, and Futurescape got picked as the first of 4 developers on the Sega VR. As stated in a 1993 press release, Nuclear Rush is a cataclysmic trek into a post-nuclear gold rush, where low-level nuclear waste is bartered as an energy source. You are posing as a nuclear pirate, piloting a hovercraft through radioactive wastelands guarded by heavily armed robots and drones. Kevin McGrath would serve as lead programmer alongside Matthew Hubbard, a veteran game developer behind Atari VCS titles such as Dolphin and Double Dunk. Tom Colley and Rick Lucy would supply the artwork, and Tara Packard would do minor uncredited work on the backgrounds. Futurescape worked closely with Sega of America and Sega Japan and was given a prototype headset to work with. Other Sega VR developers did not. Nuclear Rush was completed and even got a box art painted for it, but due to glitches in the hardware, it had to be put on hold. Preliminary work began on a possible sequel codenamed Chameleon, but it didn't go very far. Even worse, members of Stanford Research Institute were warning Sega of the hazards of Sega VR. Headaches and dizziness would occur if the graphics were out of sync with the actual movement of the player's head, and young users could get hurt. According to Mark Pesky in a 2010 interview with Audioholics, Sega took the test results from Stanford and buried them in fear of lawsuits and consumer backlash. The Sega VR never made it to market, and neither did the truth about its cancellation. Sega claimed in the press that the headset was so powerful, so immersive and realistic that it could not be shipped. Suffice to say, that wasn't true. After the death of Nuclear Rush, Futurescape Productions would continue making games for the Genesis, including a canceled title for the Sega Menacer peripheral and a film noir-inspired platformer for EA that was never finished. Futurescape's only credit on a published game was a special thanks on Balls 3D, released by Accolade in 1994. The company would cease operations later that year. Fast forward to July 2020, and co-founder Kenneth Hurley, now a manager at Google, was approached by a researcher from the preservation group Gaming Alexandria. In operation since 2015, Gaming Alexandria primarily primarily focuses on scanning gaming magazines and dumping rare and unreleased games. The Sega VR games are somewhat of a white whale for staff member Dylan Mansfield, and Hurley was happy to talk to him about his work on the headset. Hurley had kept a vast collection of source code from his 40 years as a game developer, and after a few weeks of chatting, he dug up an old CD-ROM dated August 6, 1994, containing most of the Futurescape library. Although the nearly complete source code for Nuclear Rush was available on Hurley's disk, a compiled binary, an executable build, could not be found. Searching for someone who could put it all together again, Mansfield reached out to Rich Whitehouse, head of digital conservation at the Video Game History Foundation. The VGHF is a non-profit organization founded by Frank Cifaldi, dedicated to preserving, celebrating, and teaching the history of games. In October 2020, the VGHF started the Video Game Source Project, which is focused on preserving source code, arguably the best resource for researching a game's development. Source code helps us know when every asset got made, why some content was cut, and how certain elements changed over time. For example, if we convert the old LBM files in the Nuclear Rush source code to .png, we can see dozens of scrapped graphics as well as the evolution of the game's HUD. While looking over Nuclear Rush's code, Rich Whitehouse quickly discovered problems with the Sega VR. The refresh rate for its stereoscopic images was only 15 Hz, almost 5 times lower than the 72 Hz minimum for Oculus Quest. Some of Rich's research was especially challenging. Important files like vr.doc and vr.text were completely missing in the Nuclear Rush source, so he had to figure out how the headset worked without them. On his first attempt running the ROM, Whitehouse was met with a blank screen checking for a head tracker. He found out that all interaction with the headset happens through the second controller. Presumably, this is where the headset would be plugged in. Simulating the movements, Whitehouse used the right joystick of an Xbox 360 controller hooked up to his PC. The final steps consisted of building OpenVR support into a working Genesis emulator, which meant repositioning the panels and fixing any peculiarities from 1994. Whitehouse was able to play the Sega VR on his HTC Vive VR headset, and Nuclear Rush got to run in virtual reality for the first time in over 25 years. The OpenVR emulator, alongside 2 compiled versions of Nuclear Rush, would be released on the VGHF website on November 20th, 2020, as part of their source project. It was the first game for the Sega VR and the first game by the luckless Futurescape Productions. This was an unreleased game for an unreleased piece of hardware which was recreated without even touching it, a feat that couldn't have happened without Kenneth Hurley generously donating his old work to researchers.
Strap yourselves in, this is a strange one. Here is Drax Night Out, an unreleased Nintendo Entertainment System game planned to be released by Parker Bros. In 1991. At first glance, this seems like a fairly average Nintendo game. You play as Dracula, the king of vampires, who's on a mission to find his beautiful bride Mina before sunrise. Dracula, or Drac as the game likes to call him, only has 6 hours to make it, and he constantly has to avoid angry mobs and monsters trying to get in his way. The game consists of 2 scenes. The first scene is in Drac's castle, where you strategically sneak past enemies using a plethora of Rube Goldberg-style booby traps to kill anyone in your way. The second scene has Drac out on the town, where players must go in and out of strangers' houses to find Mina's location. If you can find her before the clock strikes 6, you win. Even by NES standards, Drax Night Out is pretty simplistic. But what makes this game particularly interesting is the bizarre, blatantly last-minute promotional tie-in. Were it to be released, Drax Night Out would be the first video game featuring the Reebok Pump, a flashy line of inflatable shoes released by Reebok in 1989. While Drac is out killing innocent civilians and sucking people's blood, he's wearing some of the most stylish sneakers on the market. Good for him. It should be clear that the Reebok connection wasn't always there. Drax Night Out was the brainchild of 2 men, Mark Lesser and Rex Bradford. Did You Know Gaming managed to get in touch with both developers, who gave us plenty of insight into the game's bizarre creation. Mark Lesser got his start in video games in the early 70s, working on handheld games for companies like Mattel. In 1980, he was hired by Parker Bros., where he'd worked on Atari VCS titles like Frogger 2 and an unreleased Lord of the Rings game that was entirely finished. It was here where Lesser met programmer Rex Bradford, who was also working on the VCS and became good friends with him. Bradford was not at Parker Bros. For long, as he left for Activision's short-lived office in Boston. When that division closed in the spring of 1984, he co-founded a company of his own with fellow Parker Bros. Activision programmer Charlie Heath. Microsmiths was a tiny team of talented developers based in the coastal town of Ipswich, Massachusetts. Mark Lesser came on about a year after Microsmiths started, and most of their run in the 80s and early 90s was just the 3 of them, plus freelancers. With a company run entirely by ex-employees, Microsmiths had a close relationship with Parker Bros. Starting in 1990, Parker Bros. Began publishing games for the NES, with titles such as Heavy Shreddin' and, of course, Monopoly. Executives at the company had the original idea to do a Dracula-based game and commissioned Microsmiths to design it. Rex Bradford would come up with the castle scenes, while Mark Lesser would do the other half with the town. Parker Bros accepted the pitch, and development began on Drax Night Out. Bradford and Lesser would code, while a freelancer did the artwork. Microsmiths had no luxury of a hardware emulator on NES. All they had was a RAM-based cartridge where code could be inserted using a computer. Despite such limitations, Drax Night Out was a memorable project for both developers. Lesser, who was in the industry for over 25 years, says Drax was one of his favorite games to work on, even with its sad demise. Late into the production, Reebok hopped on board, insisting that the pump be added to the game to fulfill a licensing agreement with Parker Bros. Microsmiths objected, but had no say in the final decision. In the end, they had to do it. They distributed Reebok pump sneakers throughout the castle. When Drax touched one, he ran at increased speed for a while, much like a superstar in Mario. It was a small change, but it was the best they could do. Drax Night Out was in development for about a year. It reached the Golden Master stage and was 100% ready for release before being cancelled at the last minute. The exact reason for Drax's cancellation is unknown, but it's believed that Parker Bros decided to exit from NES development right as the game was finished. It may just be that their publication license expired and they elected not to renew. Keep in mind that Parker Bros had 2 other NES games in development at the time, both of which were cancelled. Bradford and Lesser were given free pairs of Reebok pumps for their efforts in the game. Out of spite, Lesser never wore his pumps. Regardless of no receipt, Bradford had a friend return his pair to the mall and split the money with her. Microsmiths would never develop another NES game, but continued doing titles for other systems like the Sega Genesis. They would close their doors in 1996. As Bradford recounts, "We did various other projects and tried to do more original games, but the scope of game development quickly got away from our small size, and we never rode the wave of building a big company. I went on to work at Looking Glass Studios in the 90s, and Mark and Charlie went on to do other things too. Mark did the Sega Genesis version of NHL 94 for Electronic Arts, and later formed MBL Research, and I did a couple of projects with him again. Microsmiths was a very fun and unique time." When Drax was cancelled, the developers were able to take their work home. Mark Lesser and Rex Bradford kept their copies of the final game, and eventually gave them out over time. Here is where Gideon G enters the picture. If that name rings a bell, G is one of the most prolific ROM hack translators online. He's done localizations for games like Cave Story and Shin Megami Tensei. He even did one for Star Fox 2 when the near-final build leaked in 2002. G grew up in suburban Massachusetts and had a lifelong love of video games. The NES was a big thing for him when he was in elementary school, and he found himself playing almost every day. G's parents were active in their town and knew most of the neighbors, so when they found out someone on their street, a man named Rex Bradford, was working on a game for the system, they told him right away. G got to play Drax Night Out in varying stages of development at Bradford's house, working as a young playtester. Bradford would loan a near-final cartridge to him and other neighborhood kids, and eventually he ended up with it permanently after its cancellation. It wasn't until the late 90s, when G started getting deep into the early emulation scenes, that he became aware of what he had. In the early aughts, G loaned his cartridge to an NES dumping group, where it was quickly preserved and shared online. Drax Night Out, a holy grail of the NES, was saved by the neighbor of the person who created it. G's family is still in possession of the cartridge, which currently resides in a basement in Rhode Island. Another prototype exists in the hands of Jeremy Smith. Fans of Digino Gaming may recognize that name, as we mentioned him in the first Lost Games That Were Found video. An avid collector of unreleased NES games, Smith bought his prototype years ago in an auction. The seller was someone in the industry whose boss let them take a few Nintendo prototypes home from their office. Drax Night Out was the only unreleased title in the auction. Smith bought it for a measly price of $200, and now it's one of the crown jewels of his collection. More recently, Smith purchased the original box art painting, which gives us a peek at what Drax would have looked like on a store shelf. Look, he's wearing sweatpants! While doing research for this video, Mark Lesser, co-creator of Drax Night Out, sent us something that we were not expecting. Lesser, who is now retired, had kept a copy of Drax Night Out in his collection for over 30 years. If Lesser's prototype is what the EEPROMs claim to be, it's the long-rumored master build. It should be noted that while the Gideon G prototype is beatable, we are unsure whether it is the 100% finished game. It contains several bugs during the town sequence and lacks any form of credits, so there is a chance that this prototype could be something new. Lesser was willing to get his cartridge preserved, and Digino Gaming knew just who to contact. The Video Game History Foundation, a non-profit organization we've discussed many times in our videos, has dealt with hundreds of NES prototypes. Its founder, Frank Cifaldi, had a hand in releasing most of the unreleased NES games we have today. If anyone could get the data off Lesser's chips, it would be Cifaldi. We put Lesser in touch with Cifaldi, and the conversation to get Drax Night Out, as well as any other game ephemera in his collection, preserved, is still ongoing as of this recording. Here's hoping something new can be found.
Before founding the Video Game History Foundation, Frank Cifaldi ran Lost Levels, a website primarily committed to finding unreleased Nintendo Entertainment System titles. When Lost Levels began in 2003, only 4 unreleased NES games had been preserved online. Today, there's nearly 70, including some fascinating relics like a scrapped 8-bit port of SimCity and a lost licensed platformer from Capcom, the California Raisins. Another unreleased NES game uncovered by Lost Levels is Bioforce Ape. Bioforce Ape is, without a doubt, the most infamous title on today's list. The story of this game and how it got found is a story of mystery, hoaxes, and monkeys in diapers. It's so bonkers we even briefly considered doing a video on just this story, so get comfy for this one. Bioforce Ape is believed to be developed by Sega, a Japanese arcade company known for shooter games like Twin Eagle, Meta Fox, and Arbalester. Sega was started by Jun Fujimoto in August 1982 as Sega Kikaku. It was reorganized as Sega Corporation in October 1985 and found its home in Tokyo, making titles for both the arcade and Famicom. A North American branch, Sega USA, was incorporated in Nevada in December 1989. In addition to doing video games, Sega also designed and produced gambling machines, medical equipment, and interactive television products. At its start, most of Sega's Famicom games took a safer route, in that they were ports of existing arcade titles like 1988's Thunder and Lightning. But as they became more comfortable with the console, their work got weirder with original games like the Twainian platformer The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and, of course, Bioforce Ape. Bioforce Ape made its North American debut at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in June 1991 and starred a genetically altered superhuman monkey in a diaper, searching for his lost human family in massive warehouses and labyrinths. It was an action game made special by a super speed scrolling technique and buttery smooth character animations, 2 incredibly impressive things to see on a standard Nintendo Entertainment System. While researching this video, we got exclusive information about the game from the Game Developer Research Institute, a website focused on documenting the companies and people behind classic video games. In 2010, GDRI briefly spoke to Chuck Vowell, Director of Engineering and Product Development at Sega USA. Vowell was one of 6 members of Sega USA during Bioforce Ape's production and had this to say about the game. Bioforce Ape was a very interesting property. When we showed at the Summer CES in Chicago, our booth was packed with other developers trying to figure out how we produced those types of scroll rates without supporting hardware. In Japan, Sega played a key role in the overall function of the industry, developing the software and hardware used by most of the major players. Even the Nintendo software development system used and sold by Nintendo to other Japanese licensees was a Sega product. As I understand it, these were shipped directly from Sega. More information on the game was uncovered when the 2020 Nintendo GigaLeak on 4chan gave access to the Nintendo Lot Check. For those unaware, the Lot Check is a process that ensures a Nintendo game's quality before it gets manufactured. When the title gets approved with the Nintendo seal of quality, it can make it onto store shelves. Using this data, we know that Sega submitted Bioforce Ape for a Famicom release in May 1991. What this means is that Bioforce Ape was most likely completed. There's no definitive answer to why it was never released, but Chuck Vowell recalls many publishers viewing the game as unprofitable. He stated, "After CES, I don't think anyone was really sure if it would be more profitable to release it or accept an offer on it, and possibly never see its release. I do recall that while the innovation was impressive, the game didn't have a lot else going for it. As always, to build in enough to flesh out the game would mean going to larger ROMs and driving the sales price too high to be successful." The April 1992 issue of Nintendo Power claimed the game would be sidelined for the foreseeable future, saying, "Apparently Sega does not want any monkey business right now." For years, Bioforce Ape eluded collectors. The lack of information combined with the bananas plot of a raging wrestling diaper monkey made it somewhat of a beast in the early days of the internet. On October 26, 2005, a man named Paul Brown would make a post on the classic gaming forum Digital Press. While visiting his relatives in Carson, California, Brown found a mysterious, white-labeled NES cartridge hiding in a box at a yard sale. To the shock of everyone, it was the final build of Bioforce Ape, dated June of 1991 and addressed to Sega USA. Brown began posting photos of the game in action, and it was more insane than people could have imagined. The monkey would fight against sumo wrestlers and four-armed mutants, running around an infinite hallway searching for his husband, wife, and kids. If the player pushed the A and down buttons, the monkey would unleash a fart attack so powerful that it caused the game to violently corrupt. After seeing the screenshots, the forums broke out into a fight. Some members wanted Brown to dump the game for prosperity, others told him not to, so he could maintain a higher market value of roughly $2,000. Several private collectors offered to buy Bioforce Ape. One person offered to trade it for an NES prototype of the Three Stooges. As the squabble continued, Brown would post two surprisingly relevant screenshots. We see some sort of butter monster teasing the monkey. It says, "Ja, I am made of der butter and you are worth 2K monies." The monkey correctly responds by punching the monster in the face, screaming the immortal line, "Eat communism!" By this point, most of digital press realized what was going on. Some users, however, still believed Brown and continued fighting for a few more days. Having seen the anger Bioforce Ape caused on the forum, Brown decided to put things to an end. On October 30th at 8:32 p.m., he would post a photo of the broken cartridge saying that it was too powerful and needed to be destroyed. Bioforce Ape was no more. In case it wasn't clear, the whole thread was an elaborate hoax. Paul Brown of Carson, California never existed. He was an alias by digital press regular Bratwurst. The cartridge was just a copy of Super Mario Bros. With the original sticker removed. The label was an aged envelope run through a printer and faded out in Photoshop. Bratwurst had been a part of digital press since the early aughts and was familiar with fake prototypes coming up on the forum. Weeks before the creation of Paul Brown, two pranksters claimed to have an unreleased NES prototype for The Legend of Zelda 3, a game that never existed. In a spring 2006 interview with Video Game Collector magazine, Bratwurst said, "The Zelda 3 prototype looked amateurish, and I wondered if I could come up with something that was actually convincing. I felt compelled to give people a reason to be wary in the future instead of confidently dismissing something as a fake or declaring it real at the drop of a hat." Everything was done from scratch while carefully scrutinizing magazine scans with screens from the real Bioforce Ape. I worked within the native resolution of the NES and kept in mind how televisions distort the graphics. Then I piped the images through a TV out card on my laptop onto a 36-inch television and took pictures with a digital camera. The charade was planned to end in a couple of ways. Whoever was going to dump the cart's data would receive an empty NES cartridge with an orange rubber monkey inside. One of the proto collectors would receive an unannounced package with the Bioforce Ape cart and a Super Mario Bros. Board. I heard from a few sources that some of the prototype collectors were starting to make deals based on the idea that one of them was going to get my cart and share the ROM. There wasn't any intent on my part to scam anyone of their money, and that was a potentially hot situation that needed to be cooled off. I ultimately went with the smashed cart picture because it was so immediate and guaranteed drama would ensue. The thread exploded into 13 pages of people going nuts. In the following years, Bioforce Ape became somewhat of a meme. In 2009, there were plans to turn Brown's game into a real homebrew, but it petered out after the programmer had issues with their computer. A competition cart would eventually be released in 2010 and included 2 levels, 1 boss fight, and a secret volleyball minigame with the Butter Monster. The same year, however, another Bioforce Ape prototype surfaced in a Yahoo Japan auction. It wasn't a hoax this time, it was real. It was in a Famicom Disk System RAM adapter shell, which can hold up to 4 EEPROMs. A standard cartridge can only hold 2. Notified by none other than Bratwurst himself, Frank Cifaldi and the rest of Lost Levels had an emergency meeting to discuss the listing. Getting donations from kind-hearted collectors and forum members, the team placed a bid. The auction ended at 250,000 yen on April 2nd, 2010, amusingly one day after April Fools. Lost Levels managed to get the cartridge, but when it arrived at the home of dumper Chris Koval, a photo emerged of the prototype smashed up in the mail. Thankfully, in the grand tradition of Bioforce Ape, the photo was a fake. The game arrived safe and sound and got dumped immediately. The prototype is now in storage at the Video Game History Foundation, a safe home for the weirdest NES game that we never got. On January 1st, 2022, the VGHF and fellow preservation website Hidden Palace would release a new US prototype from a private collector. It was identical to the Japanese build, but with a slight copyright change. The story of Bioforce Ape has become the stuff of legend, going from a tiny blurb in Nintendo Power to a crazy hoax to an even crazier real game. If it weren't for the hardworking historians, archivists, and collectors in the gaming community, all of these games would have been lost to time. This video would not be possible without them.
Did you know? Over 100 games for the Nintendo 64 never saw the light of day, and in these videos, we'll touch on every single one of them. However, we won't be including games that had an N64 version planned but saw a release on other platforms, such as Dragon Quest VII. We also won't be including games that were reworked into a new game, such as Dinosaur Planet, which ultimately released as Star Fox Adventures. We're also not including rumored games with no evidence to back them up, such as the rumored Timber the Tiger game from Rare. In short, we're only showing truly canceled titles. In addition to the Mario Artist software released for the 64DD, there were 4 more titles in development. These games were Graphical Message Maker, Game Maker, Sound Maker, and Video Jockey Maker. Little is known about them, but given their descriptive names, it's assumed players would be able to create music videos, send virtual greeting cards to friends, and even make their own video game, likely with heavy limitations for each one. A number of these games were also planned to go online through RandNet. As mentioned in our video on the released Mario Artist software, Sound Maker spun off from a proposed feature for Mario Paint Studio, but due to many complications behind the scenes, it was shelved, alongside the 3 other titles. Another cancelled N64 game that generally goes unnoticed is Emperor of the Jungle. Emperor of the Jungle was based on Osamu Tezuka's long-running series Jungle Emperor Leo, or Kimba the White Lion. This licensed game was being developed by Nintendo in a joint venture with Tezuka Productions, and overseen by Shigeru Miyamoto. Osamu Tezuka's eldest son, Makoto Tezuka, also served as the game's director. A demo of the game was first showcased at Space World 96 in a press conference featuring Miyamoto, Tezuka, and Nintendo Communications Director Hiroshi Imanishi. Early reception for the game was positive, and the game was set to bring in a new age of adventure games. It was aiming for a spring '98 release, but in an interview during E3 that year for Brazilian magazine Nintendo World, Miyamoto said the game ran into some issues. He said Tezuka was extremely busy and not a game designer by trade, though Nintendo gave him advice wherever possible. The title was set to be completed for 1999, but by the time the Game Developers Conference rolled around in March that year, Miyamoto had more bad news. IGN had asked him about what project he believed was his biggest blunder, to which he replied, "I cannot tell you specifically what title it was, but a while ago we asked a popular celebrity to become a game director, and together with me he was going to make a game. But that celebrity was too busy to concentrate on game design, so even though he spent a lot of time working on the game, we could not release it to the market." It's safe to say he was referring to the fate of Emperor of the Jungle, which was quietly swept under the rug by the end of the year. Coincidentally, an earlier Kimba game was also cancelled, being made for the Famicom in 1990. One cancelled N64 game you've probably never heard about before was the oddly titled Cabbage. Cabbage was a virtual pet simulator game first announced in 1997, being made by the likes of Miyamoto, Shigesato Itoi, and Tsunekazu Ishihara. According to an interview from 64 Dream magazine, the name stemmed from Itoi, who had randomly blurted out the name one day and it ended up sticking. Satoru Iwata also had a hand in the project, and it apparently flew under the radar of company president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Cabbage was being developed for the 64DD, as Miyamoto wanted the game to have a clock function, where events could occur when the system wasn't powered on, such as your creature evolving into a different creature. It was also planned to work with the Game Boy Transfer Pack, with players being able to transfer the pet and carry it around with them, similar to Pokémon. The game's release would have been followed up with additional discs that had extra toys for the creatures to play with, which could be swapped with friends. Cabbage was planned to have a playable showing at Space World 2000, but nothing ever surfaced. Although Cabbage was cancelled, some of the game's ideas were used in other Nintendo titles, such as Animal Crossing, Nintendogs, and possibly more. He also recalled Itoi and Ishihara being rather busy with other things at the time, such as Itoi working on the ill-fated Mother 3 for N64, and Ishihara overseeing the then newly formed Pokémon Company. Nintendo also had a number of smaller games planned for their 64DD add-on. One title, named DD Sequencer, was some kind of music creation software that appeared on RANNet's homepage. Nothing else is known about it, though the title was listed next to Mario Soundmaker on RANNet, implying it was an entirely separate game. Another game was also listed on RANNet called Digital Space Newspaper. This title would have given 64DD users access to news related to horse racing, baseball, and Formula 1 racing. Considering the title would likely have displayed in 240p or 360p, reading long articles through this service would probably have become tedious fairly quickly. Another title named Wall Street DD was made to simulate the ups and downs of the stock market, and was quoted by IGN as the killer app of the 64DD. Now, although that's all of Nintendo's cancelled first-party offerings, many cancelled games were made in collaboration with Nintendo. The elusive title Cat Roots was developed by Marigal, a company partly owned by Nintendo. Footage of the game was shown off at E3 2000, featuring a cat and mouse engaging in cartoon violence, in this case the cat being hunted down by the mouse. The demo showcased some impressive animation for the console, but didn't give a solid indication of what the game's genre would be. The game didn't make any notable appearances outside this showing and was never seen again. Another canned N64 title was a basketball game called Monster Dunk. The title was in development at Mindscape, one of Nintendo's partners under the Dream Team label when the N64 was codenamed Project Reality and Ultra 64. It was announced at E3 95 and was set to have stunning effects produced by Silicon Graphics workstations. Monster Dunk was described as a haunted NBA Jam, with famous monsters facing off in 2-on-2 matches and court hazards like hands coming out of the floor to grab the player's legs. By late 96, Mindscape ran into financial difficulties and cut back on their video game output, with Monster Dunk being one of the cancelled games. Another company that worked closely with Nintendo during this era was DMA Design, who would later become Rockstar North. The studio made a few unreleased games with input from Nintendo. The racing game Go-Karts never had an official reveal and went away as quietly as it came. All that's left of the project are a few prototype images of racers, karts, and a presumed logo for the game itself. It's speculated that Nintendo was the publisher. A more ambitious project DMA had in mind for the system was a title called Zenith. During development of one of the studio's other projects, Body Harvest, a game under the name Climber started to make the rounds. With only the name to go on, some speculated this was a game based off of the NES title Ice Climber, though it was more of a racer. The game was said to be published by Nintendo and had a mix of platformer and racing elements, being described by one developer as a vertical obstacle course. The locations of the races would range from medieval times to the Wild West. The aforementioned Body Harvest was going through development issues, and the studio had to come to a tough decision. Body Harvest was the studio's top priority, meaning Zenith had to be put on the back burner. Some members of the Zenith team moved over to Body Harvest, while several others left the company altogether when frustration reached a boiling point. Still, the decision to cancel Zenith ensured Body Harvest came out at all. One of the most lamented losses to the N64 library was a Pokémon title, which went under the name Pocket Monsters RPG and sometimes called Pocket Monsters DD. It's thought the game would have been in line with the main Pokémon series, but for home consoles. The only first-hand mention of it was in a 1997 interview with Miyamoto, conducted by Electronic Gaming Monthly. When asked about the game's progress, he said 10 people were currently working on the game, and that while it was planned to come out in Japan, a US release was still up in the air. In a 1998 IGN article, the site listed 4 upcoming Pokémon N64 games: Pokémon RPG, Hey You Pikachu, Pokémon Snap, and Pokémon Stadium, implying Pokémon RPG was an entirely different game than Stadium, despite both being turn-based. Another studio with a close relationship to Nintendo is the legendary Rare. One can title, Velvet Dark, was planned to be a sister title to Perfect Dark. It would have fittingly focused on Joanna Dark's presumed sister, Velvet, expanding on her character and the overall Perfect Dark universe. As opposed to the series' FPS roots, this game was said to be more of a third-person adventure game with elements of stealth, taking a page from Metal Gear Solid. Development started sometime in '99, and a trademark was filed for the game in January 2000. Just 1 month later, news broke of Rare registering the domain velvetdark.com. Pre-production was done on the game for roughly a year, but it didn't go any further than that, never getting the official green light. The cover of the game's design doc was later uploaded to Twitter by designer Greg Mayles in July 2015, with a marked date of October 30th, 2000. Though he didn't share the details of what was inside, the table of contents gave a few clues as to what was planned. Some of these ideas include plot details, a multiplayer mode, and connectivity with the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. Speaking of canceled games with Game Boy connectivity, the Wars series had an entry planned for the N64, developed not by the usual Intelligent Systems, but rather by Hudson Soft, who made a few Wars entries on Game Boy. Similar to other games in the series, such as Advance Wars, the game used a 2D map for moving troops during gameplay. It also had 2-player support and was planned to connect with Game Boy Wars 2 via the transfer pack. Players would be able to start a match on the 64, keep the battle going on Game Boy, and go back to the 64 to finish it. The game was shown at Space World 1999 and was set to be released on January 29th that year for a retail price of 6,800 yen. It's not known why it was cancelled, but it seems to have gotten pretty far along in development. Developer Real Time Associates was making an RPG titled Mystics for the N64, though it's unknown just when it was being made. The NES World website documented a blurb about what the game might have entailed from the studio's president, David Warhol, dated to February 19, 2008. According to him, the game was all about real-time spellcasting. Up to 4 players would collect mana based on water, earth, sky, and air to use it offensively or defensively. The game also had a single-player mode centering on this mechanic, and Illusion Machines was brought on to assist with game design. Nintendo had commissioned a prototype, but allegedly backed out not long after. The company had considered reworking the game as a WiiWare title years later, but nothing came from that either. Another cancelled game was a third-person adventure title named Rika, which was being developed by Bit Studios with Nintendo as publisher. The Rika name first surfaced October 27, 1998, when Nintendo of America registered the domain name Rika.com. In April '99, Nintendo Power would confirm the domain was for an upcoming title. In the game, players took control of a female character named Rika, with comparisons being made to both Tomb Raider and Rare's Perfect Dark. The game was playable at E3 '99 and was on track for a 2000 release, but come the new year, Nintendo hadn't shared any more info. Bit Studios told IGN assumed things were going smoothly, but no further updates came out, and there were rumors that Rika had shifted over to the GameCube. In June 2016, footage of the game surfaced online, uploaded by a user on the Assembler Games forums who worked at Bits in the late 90s. In addition to this, he clarified the game was more of an adventure title akin to Ocarina of Time, having sprinkles of open-world gameplay and 3 playable characters. The reason it was cancelled was due to the N64 nearing the end of its life cycle by 2000. He also said Bits was a small studio and were working on 2 other games, with the higher-ups deciding to cancel Rika and reallocate the team to other projects. The unreleased title Klepto was a stealth-based adventure by Utopia Technologies and Sandbox Studios. One of the game's developers, Atman Binstock, wanted to make a third-person game featuring a grappling hook, inspired by the Umihara Kawase series. It would have been set in a sci-fi world, and missions could be tackled in multiple ways, sneaking into a room undetected, or throwing caution to the wind and fighting your way out of a jam. The grappling hook would interact with enemies and could be upgraded with different weapons and gadgets. A playable demo was put together for E3 1999, and multiple parties, Nintendo included, showed interest in publishing the title, but ultimately backed out. Nintendo did suggest they bring the title over to the GameCube, but the team's budget didn't allow for it. The N64 had several canned titles from Paradigm Entertainment, who had a close relationship with Nintendo. The company had its roots in making realistic flight sims for various clients, some involving space travel and military training. Nintendo contacted the company in '94 to assist with a launch game for the N64, and Paradigm took it upon themselves to convert another piece of software titled VX Vampire XDV7 to the N64 as well. XDV7 was visually impressive for the time, likely because it was a military training sim. Screenshots from the sim were sent to magazines, boasting the N64 could faithfully recreate the visuals. In reality, the title was running on the Silicon Graphics Onyx Reality Engine, hardware more advanced than the N64. It's believed XDV7 was put on hold so Paradigm could focus on making Pilot Wings 64 with Nintendo. Following Pilot Wings' success, Paradigm's entertainment division spun off into its own company, solely focusing on game development. One of their next projects would be a follow-up to Pilot Wings 64. On June 18, 1997, IGN reported on a statement from Paradigm during E3. Head of development Gary Bandy simply said, "There will be a sequel to Pilot Wings, and Paradigm is working on it." They also said the game was in its early stages, and there were talks of releasing it on the 64DD, though by February '98, the game tentatively titled Pilot Wings 64-2 was shelved. The reason for cancellation was due to Nintendo having their hands full with other projects. They couldn't provide resources despite seeing promise in the game. Another canned game from Paradigm was Harrier 2000, to be published by the Japan-based Video System. It was a flight sim originally named Flights of the UN. A preview of the game in GamePro's October '98 issue said it was roughly 60% complete. They also said the game would release in December, before it was pushed back to summer '99 in the US and fall '99 for the UK. It also received another name change to Harrier 2001. Despite the game's progress, Video System told IGN the game was put on indefinite hold that November. In December, IGN obtained documents relating to a lawsuit Paradigm filed against the publisher earlier in May. The suit mainly referred to a lack of resources and finances provided by Video System, with Video System telling Paradigm to cease all production on the game on April 16, 1999. Another flight sim that never saw the light of day was F-18 Super Hornet. Published by Titus and developed by Digital Integration, the game was set to have accurate flight physics, realistic graphics, and a 2-player battle mode. It was planned for a late '99 release, but was cancelled before it could take off. Other sim games planned to come to the system included XSW1, which was in development at Video System. The only proof of its existence comes from the name showing up on a release list of upcoming titles in the April '97 issue of N64 magazine. Based on the name and the developer's portfolio, it was likely planned as some sort of flight or war title. The game Lethal Encounter was in the works at British studio Digital Image Design. Like Paradigm, Digital Image had their hand in flight sims, with notable clients including the Royal Air Force and British Airways. Lethal Encounter was a third-person action title, with its only showing in the August '98 issue of Edge magazine. The blurb about the game described it as a mix between Turok and Battlezone, with elements reminiscent of Star Fox 64. Every one of Digital Image's titles had been published by Ocean Software from 1989 to 1998, 1978, but in 98, Ocean merged with French publisher Infogrames, becoming Infogrames UK. Following the takeover, several key members of Digital Image left the company, including co-founder Martin Kenwright, who formed Evolution Studios in 99. It's assumed Lethal Encounter was a casualty of the buyout, as no further updates surfaced. Developer GameTech revealed Robotech Crystal Dreams shortly before the N64's launch. Based on the 80s sci-fi anime of the same name, the game featured 4-person multiplayer, rumble support, and over 40 minutes of voiceover spanning 15 characters. Originally slated for a late 96 release, it was pushed back to 97. That same year, GameTech ran into financial troubles, filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. By late 97, only one person was still actively working on the game, with the rest of the studio working on other projects. Despite all this, GameTech assured fans Robotech was alive and kicking, with all hands on deck come January 98. The game was shown at that year's E3, but there was still much uncertainty behind the scenes. Robotech struggled to find a publisher, with GameTech considering self-publishing, even with the odds against them. By July 98, however, the dream was dead. A former GameTech employee told IGN, "We came in on Monday, July 20 to work as usual, and there was a sign on the door saying GameTech was closed due to bankruptcy. We were allowed to pick up our personal belongings, and that was the end. GameTech ran out of money." Not all was lost though, as following GameTech's closure, a developer acquired an N64 dev kit and dumped Robotech's ROM online, being the build from E3 98. One mysterious cancelled N64 game is Okuuchi Gengoru Ika. Practically nothing is known about the game's subject matter, but in 2005, a prototype cartridge of the game was sold at a Japanese auction for roughly 57,000 yen. Only a few screenshots of the game were posted online, but based on the images and brief blurbs about it on Japanese blogs, it seems to have been some kind of family simulator. Developer Culture Brain had plans for a baseball title called Ultra Baseball 64, an entry in their baseball simulator series. It's not known when it would have been released or why it was scrapped, though it's likely to have stayed in Japan. Culture Brain's USA division was responsible for reworking the studio's games in an effort to appeal to Westerners. Despite their efforts, their games sold very poorly in the West. Keeping to the theme of sports, Soccer 64 was being developed by Hudson Soft. The game was only ever mentioned in the UK-based N64 magazine in April 97, shown in a list of then upcoming titles for the console. It was listed as to be announced for Japan, with no release date for other regions, so it likely didn't get far in development. The 64 disk drive was planned to be the home for a title called Desert Island 64. It centered on players surviving on a deserted island, taking elements from RPGs, platformers, and real-time simulators like The Sims. It was first shown off at Space World 96 under the name Super Real Island. Developer Imagineer's plans to set their sights on the DD effectively shot them in the foot. On August 2nd, 1999, IGN reported the game resurfaced under a new name, Desert Island, saying the studio was wondering whether to make the game for the base N64 console or carry it over to Sega's then upcoming Dreamcast system. It's believed its cancellation was due to Imagineer running into financial issues at the time, with Desert Island being affected by this. All that survives of the project are a handful of screenshots, a few pieces of concept art, and scans from 1998 issues of German magazine Nintendo Funvision, as well as text from an unknown magazine. Though the N64 library had a poor selection of RPGs, a fair number of role-playing games were planned for the console. As well as Desert Island 64, the company Imagineer was planning a sequel to Quest 64. Come January 26th of 1999, IGN gave a preview of what was to come, giving details on the story and some gameplay ideas. Quest 64 had a mixed reception, but Imagineer aimed for bigger and better with the sequel. It would have had better visuals and overall performance, less restrictive movement, and a sidekick called The Guardian, being compared to Ocarina of Time's Epona by IGN. The game would have also had a money system in place, with players earning money from enemies and being able to spend it on new weapons and the like. It seemed to be shaping up nicely and was shooting for a release by the end of '99, but soon got the axe, likely due to Imagineer's financial issues. Only a few pieces of concept art were ever uncovered. Studio Pixel Play was working on an RPG title called Blades of Passage, planned as a launch title for the 64DD's North American debut. The game was envisioned as a 3D update to classic RPG titles such as Secret of Mana. One of the developers at Pixel Play, Richard Knight, recalled the game's troubled development on his website. When he joined the team, the game was already in a tough spot. With the DD's North American launch cancelled, devs were ordered to move any incomplete projects to the GameCube. The team had a lot of hope for the game as it was their first project. However, the game was nowhere near complete, even after 3 years of development. With its cancellation, Pixel Play reformed into Orbital Media and swapped N64 dev kits for Game Boy Advance kits. A handful of screenshots have been found for Blades of Passage, as well as the game's logo. Developer David Richardson also showcased several pieces of concept art in a demo reel in 2007. Quest for Camelot 64 was based on the titular 1998 animated film and was planned to work with the 64DD. The game was being made by Titus and was scheduled for release in the second quarter of '98. Ultimately, though, Quest for Camelot didn't get past the planning stages, and after the movie proved to be a box office bomb, the game was scrapped entirely. Unfortunately for them, Titus then devoted their resources to finishing Superman 64. A Quest for Camelot title did come to the Game Boy Color, published by Titus France, but the game was conceptually different due to the vastly different specs of the two systems. Another disk drive title was DT64, developed by Marigal and Game Studio. It appeared in a list of upcoming games put out by IGN in January '98 and was the most mysterious of the lineup. It later went under the name Bloodmaster and centered around card collecting and trading. The game was planned to be the first title to connect the 64DD and Game Boy, with the Game Boy version of DT featuring a slot on the top that connected to the console. It was shown at Space World '99, albeit only in logo form, and a display of the consoles linking together via the GB connection cable. IGN reported a release date for sometime in 2000, but the N64 version was ultimately cancelled. That said, a DT game called Lords of Genomes did come out for the Game Boy Color in 2001, exclusively in Japan. A screenshot of a blue-haired boy from the N64 version appears on the box art of the Game Boy game, indicating some carryover from the original title. Even the likes of Konami wanted to bring RPGs to the N64, such as with Dear Blue. The game's name appeared in the March '98 issue of Nintendo Power and would soon appear on other lists of N64 games in development. These would prove to be the only mentions of the game, as the name never popped up anywhere again. It's possible the game may have had some connection to another Konami RPG series called Survival Kids, which had an entry on the DS titled Lost in Blue. A soundtrack for the earlier Konami title Salamander also features a song titled Dear Blue, though its relationship to the N64 game is uncertain. The game Project Cairo was previewed by IGN in November '97 and planned for a '99 release on the disk drive. It was in development at Crave Entertainment, or rather their studio Craveyard, who had a background in RPGs, previously working in the US division of Square. Details on the game are extremely vague, though the game was set to feature a major comic book license and a popular comic artist. Crave's vice president Mark Burke said the game's more Western look would help set it apart from other RPGs that had anime art styles, and claimed the art went toe-to-toe with Final Fantasy VII. Unseen64 got in touch with former developer Ted Woolsey in April 2016, who explained the game never got past the scenario phase. It was also revealed a well-known fantasy writer based in Britain was involved at some point, though they were never name-dropped. One RPG for the system that sparked a lot of discussion was actually a fan remake of Chrono Trigger called Chrono Resurrection. Headed by Nathan Lazar, development began in 1999, after Lazar pondered what the original game would look like if it made the jump to 3D. After brushing up on his programming skills, he set to make that dream a reality. He chose the N64 over the PS1 as it was something he was much more familiar with tech-wise, and he was a fan of Nintendo. The game would have featured two different modes, one that was more in line with the original game with a high amount of detail and a variety of 3D effects. The second mode would be in full 3D and would have a top-down view similar to the original game, requiring the console's expansion pack to run properly. It would have also had a gallery mode where players could unlock mini-games, as well as fan artwork and music tracks. Production on the N64 was halted in mid-2000 for several reasons, but resurfaced in April 2003 for systems such as the Xbox and GameCube. The 9-man team were shooting for a Christmas 2004 release, but legal troubles with Square put a stop to the project. After receiving a cease and desist, the team closed the project on September 6, 2004. RPGs weren't common on the N64, but platformers were the system's bread and butter. Though the genre was never in short supply, there could have been even more. D-Jump was a platformer being made for Dreamcast, PC, PS2, as well as the N64. Developed by Ubisoft Paris, it starred a Rastafarian character named D, jumping through various time periods and trying to find out why he's slowly turning into wood. The title had a few previews in European magazines, such as the October '98 issue of Gameplay 64. It was a apparently supposed to be a launch title for the PS2 in European markets, but the game was cancelled on all platforms. The release of the original Glover was enough of a success that a sequel was underway by July 1999. However, its cancellation stems from a uniquely unfortunate slip-up. A former programmer at Interactive Studios, James Steele, posted a blog entry detailing the story behind Glover 2's axing. Publisher Hasbro Interactive had ordered a production run of 150,000 units for the first Glover. If they sold through that number, it would be seen as a success, which ended up happening and led to development for a sequel. However, Glover actually had twice the amount of units ordered, as Nintendo had a special where they were selling carts at a discount price. Somebody at Hasbro decided to put in an order for 300,000 carts, leaving the company with a pile of Glover 1 carts left over and no demand from retailers to take the extra stock. Hasbro grew to resent the brand and decided to cancel the sequel. A prototype of the game was dumped online in 2010, being around 60% complete. Tonic Trouble DD was an expansion to adventure platformer titled Tonic Trouble that would release after the cartridge version in '97. The expansion was cancelled, probably due to the DD's failure, but a sequel called Tonic Adventure was planned at one point for Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, which may have incorporated some content from the expansion. British studio Curved Logic had a platformer in the works called Jest, starring a jester's apprentice, Jax, who dreamt of becoming a jester. The journey took place in the land of Humorous, and level archetypes included the Wild West, Hades, the North Pole, and Chicago. Footage was first shown at Space World 97, with the game scheduled for a late '98 release. It made a few more appearances at trade shows in video form, before falling off the radar completely by the end of '99. Another cancelled platformer was Space Jelly. This game was in development at Software Creations, and also went under the name Moon Jelly. It allegedly began life as a concept created by the Pickford brothers, who shopped the idea around to publishers. The brothers ended up leaving Software Creations around '95-'96, but the studio continued working on the title. The game featured a character called Johnny Forbidden in a plot to save the Earth from a legion of space pirates. A few preview articles on the game noted its lack of publisher, which may be one reason the game never came out. Another platformer was Weekends, developed by Super Happy Fun Fun, though not much is known about it. NESworld.com had stumbled across the website of one of the game's developers, who talked briefly about the title. It was described as a platformer in the vein of Mario, and players could play as either a boy or girl. A small blue companion named Weekend would help the player out and could be used for combination attacks or to break out of reach items. The game had no press and was just a prototype, only being in development for less than a year. It was cancelled due to the team being unable to fund the project, on top of being unable to find a publisher. Besides platformers, a fair share of action games were planned for the system as well. Created by Paradox Games, The Reign of Dogs and Cats had both action and strategy elements, and was in development sometime around '98. What little is known about the game comes from one of its developers, Jeremy Townsend. His roles included project design, character modeling and animation, and team leadership. The game was his first professional project, being fresh out of high school, and he blamed its eventual downfall partially to his lack of programming know-how at the time. He also claimed to have video footage of the game, though nothing has ever surfaced. Factor 5 also had a game in the works titled Tornado. First announced in April '97, the game also went under the name Turrican 64. The original name was changed when Factor 5 couldn't reach a deal with Turrican's original publisher, and settled on a combination of the words Tornado and Thor for a new name. The story saw players defending Earth from aliens, and living up to its namesake, featured several wind-based weapons. The player could be a man or woman, and was planned to have simultaneous two-person multiplayer without the use of split screen. This would have been done by lessening the detail of the characters, with the downgrade hidden by zooming out the game's camera. N64 Magazine showed a release window for '98, which was later pushed back to '99. By 2000, the project moved to GameCube, though that version never materialized either. There were also talks of a disk drive version, which again never went anywhere. One cancelled game comes from Studio Z-Axis, who worked on a title called Rollerball, loosely based on the 1975 film of the same name. Taking place in a dystopian future and centering around an extreme death sport, many of the game's moves and attacks were apparently motion captured from wrestlers and martial arts masters. The team originally shot for a '97 release, but it was pushed back to '98 and later '99, with MGM apparently telling IGN the release would coincide with a sequel to the original film. What's confusing about this is the fact that Rollerball never received a proper sequel, rather a remake that was released in 2002, which may link to the game's absence. Whatever the case, a logo and screenshot are the sole remnants of the project. There were also plans to release a version on the PS1. Another cancelled N64 game from Konami was an action game called Survivor Day 1. Officially unveiled at E3 '98, the game's name was leaked on Nintendo's own website earlier that April. Players took on the role of a genetically engineered humanoid life form, with the goal of escaping a crashed spaceship before it sunk. They also had to save a female companion trapped on board, all while fending off alien mutants who were also trying to escape. The October '98 issue of Game Pro claimed the game was 70% complete and would be out for the first quarter of '99. However, the press found Survivor's gameplay none too impressive. IGN made note of Konami bringing the game to their offices several times, and with each visit, it seemed to get worse and worse. Some issues included poor visuals, bad controls, and a terrible frame rate brought on by the game's semi-high resolution mode. Survivor itself became a sinking ship, and in December '98, Konami cancelled the game. Konami also had plans to bring the Contra series to the N64. A source from the company told IGN the game was being developed in-house and went under the name Contra Spirits 64. The only other details given were the classic Contra gameplay being remade in 3D, with the camera changing angles at times. Konami's US branch had no word on the game's existence, and by January '99, IGN's source came back with the news of the game's cancellation. The reason given was due to the Contra team disbanding and splitting up to work on other projects. Probably the title we know the least about on this entire list is Conscripts. The game was in development at Software Creations, and besides that, not much else is known about it, other than it was an action strategy title that was cancelled. The game War Spirits was in the works at Candlelight Studios around 1998 for both the N64 and PS1. The game's lead programmer, Duncan Chambers, had the task of getting the game running on the N64 hardware. Chambers believed its cancellation was behind financial troubles and being unable to find a publisher, with Candlelight fizzling out not long after. As War Spirits was still in its demo phase, Chambers himself wasn't sure what it was about either. Another action title called Deadly Honor was being made by Tech Magic and had the involvement of everyone's favorite action star, Steven Seagal. In 1993, the studio announced an action game for the Super Nintendo called The Final Option, with Seagal as the lead. The game was scheduled for a '94 release before being delayed to '95 and later being cancelled. Come the N64, Tech Magic took another crack at the concept. By the end of March '98, however, IGN reported the game was on hold and was subsequently cancelled. The title First Samurai 64 was going to be a sequel to the Amiga game First Samurai and was developed by British studio Vivid Image. First Samurai 64 had elements of exploration and action a la Tomb Raider, and players could also take on foes one-on-one similar to a single-screen fighting game. Vivid also had plans for a multiplayer mode, keeping in line with their history of multiplayer titles such as Street Racer and Scars. The game had a vague release date for '99, but nothing ever surfaced. Another cancelled N64 game was Magic Flute. This was apparently an action title in development at Sunsoft USA and had a '98 release date, with nothing more known about the project. A game based on the manga and anime Golgo 13 was in the works at Vic Tokai, which followed the life of a professional assassin for hire. IGN reported on it in June of '97, with Tokai telling them that it was 3/4 complete, possibly being ready for the end of that year. It's presumed the game was an update to an earlier NES title, but it was eventually cancelled with nothing to show for it. It may also have been a port of one of the PS1 Golgo 13 titles, but since the game was never shown, it's impossible to say without more information. One licensed title that did release on the N64 was a game based on the '96 film Mission Impossible. The original game released on the 64 in July '98, but it was planned to have a disk drive expansion, where players would have access to extra levels. Though reception to Mission Impossible was lukewarm, developer Infogrames had a sequel planned. After a few months of work, the studio failed to hold on to the Mission Impossible license. The game was reworked into another licensed game for the PS2, La Femme Nikita, a French action thriller franchise. However, this game was also cancelled due to, quote, economic reasons. In January '97, Tech Magic confirmed a game called Roto Gunners was being made for the N64. It would have featured arcade-style gameplay and had players control a helicopter. It can be assumed it didn't get too far along given the limited amount of info. Another cancelled title was developed by the company Sapphire. They worked on a title known as Young Olympians Mythos, that was also known as, somewhat confusingly, Sapphire. It began life as an adventure title before turning into a fighter with RPG elements. It focused on 5 teenagers with the powers of the Greek gods, out to save the world from Hades. A GameSpot article claimed the game would release on N64 in summer 2000, with the possibility of it coming to other platforms. It would eventually make the jump to next-gen systems, and was going to be a part of an even larger larger franchise, including a comic book and possibly a TV series. All plans for the franchise were ultimately shelved. A more obscure title was Bad Company. The game's head designer was Antonio Barnes, who'd worked on other unreleased games for the system, including a title called Air Demons. It's also believed development of Bad Company took place at THQ. Air Demons was supposedly being developed by Sunsoft for 98, but aside from that, nothing else is known about these games. There was also a surprising amount of scrapped arcade revivals for the system, such as at Midway, where a Joust game was in the works. Cited as a 3D update to the 80s arcade game, the name Joust X and Joust 64 appeared in a number of magazines and website features. In January 97, IGN stated it would be out by that summer at the earliest, but nothing else ever surfaced. Joust eventually made its way to the console, in its original form via a Midway compilation released in 2000. Midway also had plans for a title called Centipede X, a shoot-'em-up that was cancelled by 97. No further info is surfaced, though it was likely a 3D adaptation of the arcade classic Centipede. Developer Foley High Tech had 3 titles in development for the system at some point, but they likely didn't get far along as the company shut down in 96. All there is to go on are their names, being Silver Squadron, Defender X, and Sinistar X. Silver Squadron is presumed to be some sort of shooter, with the other 2 titles suspected to be reimaginings of the arcade games Defend and Sinistar. There's a fair number of shooters that missed the mark on the console as well. South Park, which released as a multi-platform title but found most of its footing on N64, was going to have a sequel. South Park 2 was in the works for a time, likely falling into the same FPS style of the first game. It was announced by CEO of Acclaim Greg Fishbach on January 12, 99, just 1 month after the first game released in North America. Given that Iguana Entertainment was responsible for South Park's N64 version, it's likely they would have done the same for the sequel. Still, for whatever reason, it never came out. Another canned FPS was Unreal 64, made by Epic Mega Games. At one point, there was a port in development for the 64DD, with the team's marketing director Mark Rain saying they'd rather tackle the DD as opposed to a cartridge. Although he believed making the game on cartridge would be possible, they'd have to make huge compromises to the game's visuals. Regardless, Unreal 64 never released, likely due to the failure of the 64DD. This wasn't the only classic shooter to get the boot. Doom 64 had a cancelled follow-up called Doom Absolution. It would have had a strong focus on multiplayer, with a Midway rep stating Nintendo never gave them the tools to do a multiplayer in Doom 64. Development started shortly after the first Doom 64 released in spring of 97 and was cancelled nearly as quickly. In January 2019, Tim Hadelar, a level designer at Midway, posted on the Doom World fan site about Doom development stories, including facts about Absolution. He said a fair amount of levels had been completed, that the multiplayer was fully playable, and that levels took place on the moon or some similar type of surface. He cited the reasons for the game's cancellation was in part due to politics, mainly due to the Midway team putting most of their resources into Quake 64, believing it would be a smarter business decision than another Doom sequel, despite the franchise's popularity. The title Jungle Bots was a game being developed by Conceptual Realities. It centered on a desert island overrun by robotic animals, with the player given the task of hunting them down. IGN reported on the game on March 26, 1998, with the publisher Titus telling them it was planned for a Q1 1999 release. By April 12, 1999, however, Titus confirmed the game had been cancelled. This was because the game wasn't coming together like they hoped, and they thought it would be a hard sell for the international market. One of the more interesting cases of a cancelled title comes with Tommy Thunder, developed by Player One and published by ASC Games. Its existence and eventual uncovering all stems from a link on Player One's website back in 97. Said link led to their FTP site, accessible to anyone who stumbled upon it. 2 files labeled robo64.zip and tommy.zip were available for download, albeit password protected. It wasn't until November 2007 when a user on lostlevels.org was able to crack open the files. Robo64.zip was attributed to the complete and released Robotron 64, and Tommy.zip to the unreleased Tommy Thunder. Recalling the project, Tommy Thunder's producer, George Weissing, explained the game was submitted to Ken Lobb during his time at Nintendo, and eventually switched over to the PlayStation, hoping to reach the scope they envisioned for the game, though production didn't get far. The reason for its cancellation was due to Player One closing up shop, with studio president Holly Herzl citing bad luck with publishers. She felt they'd bet on the wrong horse, setting their sights on Sega's Dreamcast as opposed to Microsoft's Xbox. The canned title Blade and Barrel was being developed by Kemco and Software Creations. Development on the title started April 1st of 95, with it planned as an Ultra 64 launch title named Ultra Combat in America. It was envisioned as a 3D update to the Atari title Combat and featured 4-person multiplayer. The game was showcased at several trade trade shows in Japan and appeared in a number of European gaming magazines. Issue 106 of GamePro slated the game for a Q4 '97 release, though this never came to pass. On October 23rd that same year, IGN reported its cancellation, though Kemco had plans to revamp the game completely before this happened. The Pickford brothers' site claims after John Pickford left Software Creations, the game was picked up by a Japanese publisher and became an on-rails shooter, with the publisher canning the game not long after. With games like The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask, the vaguely titled adventure game genre was another defining part of the N64's library. Shadowgate Rising was a joint project between Infinite Ventures and ImageSpace. The title was a sequel to Shadowgate 64, Trials of the Four Towers, slated for a late '99 release on N64 and PC. It starred a woman named Raven, and in March of '99, a comic book series centering on her was posted on the Shadowgate website, though the story was never finished. At some point during development, the N64 version was shelved, and the team set their sights on the PC, though in the end, nothing materialized. Dead Ahead was another title from Software Creations, being made in conjunction with Optical Entertainment. Originally slated for a holiday '97 release, a preview in EGM described it as an adventure game with fighter elements similar to Tekken and RPG elements from Final Fantasy and Zelda. EGM even went on to say it could be the most genre-defining fighter since Street Fighter II. One notable team member was the game's composer, David Newman, who worked on films such as Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and The Flintstones. Despite having a talented lineup of developers, things weren't so great behind the scenes. The team's manager, Hayden Dalton, said that before production had even started, nobody wanted anything to do with the project. Another developer recalled the game on Reddit, saying their publisher Tommy wasn't a big name in the West when it came to video games, which was a problem. The team tried pitching the game to Acclaim amongst a few other studios, but to no avail. A lack of interest led to the ambitious title being scrapped. One title in development at UK-based International Computer Entertainment, or ICE, was Spooky. The title was first shown off in late '97, depicting the player's task of saving an alien world from a race called the Archmorph. The player would do this by seeking out 30 pieces of a mirror, with some only being accessible after defeating certain enemies. The protagonist would have been able to mutate into 3 different forms, each with different fighting techniques and moves to solve puzzles, something akin to Majora's Mask. ICE also said the game featured real-time cutscenes with a comic book aesthetic. N64 Magazine's December '97 issue had the game slated for a vague '98 release, but alas, it never released. Another cancelled 64DD game comes from HAL Laboratory, titled Metal Slater Glory 2. This was a follow-up to the original 1991 title on Famicom, and would have utilized the add-on's unique features such as the internal clock and rewritable discs. For one reason or another, the game never came to be. But not all was lost for the series. Series creator Yoshimiru Hoshi and his team would go on to release a director's cut of the first game for the Super Famicom in 2000, which ended up being the last officially released title for the console. Mario Kart 64 cemented the racing genre as a staple on the N64. This led to many more racers being made for the system, but not all of them crossed the finish line. Kyle Petty's No Fear Racing 64 was a tech demo of sorts that shared its name with a previous title on the Super Nintendo. The title was unveiled during the initial reveal of the Ultra 64 in 1995. Only a handful of screenshots were shown, featured in issue number 4 of French gaming magazine's CD Consoles. The game was being developed by Leland Interactive and was being published by Williams Entertainment, with no reason given for its cancellation. The scrapped Wild Waters by Looking Glass was announced at E3 '99 and would have had several game modes that boasted impressive water physics for the time. However, the studio was facing serious financial issues. Looking Glass ended up closing down in May 2000, with Wild Water going under with them. A dump of the game was found by the ROM group Team Carrot and uploaded online in April 2012. This build only features the first level, which, when completed, the player's kayak falls out of bounds. Looking Glass worked on another N64 racer called Mini Racers, also revealed during E3 '99. Mini Racers had both single and multiplayer modes, with multiplayer working in either split-screen or top-down mode, akin to Rare's RC Pro Am games. The game even had a track editor that allowed players to make their own courses. Mini Racers was playable at several trade shows that year, but failed to materialize after Looking Glass closed its doors. Even so, in May 2000, IGN said a source affiliated with the studio claimed Mini Racers was in the hands of Nintendo, having been completed and approved. Nothing came from this, though in April 2012, Team Carrot released a ROM of Mini Racers, though as expected, the build is far from complete. Tamiya Racing was a title developed by Intermetrics, yet again in association with Looking Glass. In 2012, an early prototype surfaced on eBay from a seller who also had possession of the Wild Waters prototype. The cart sold for $1,358.33, and by April 5th, the ROM was dumped online, once again thanks to the efforts of Team Carrot. Angel Studios' Buggy Boogie went through several changes before being shelved. It was announced for the Ultra 64 in 1995, originally being a much darker game that centered around arena mech battles, with cars being able to eat the competition and take on different forms. While under the Dream Team umbrella, Angel Studios worked closely with Nintendo on the project, even under the watchful eye of Miyamoto, who felt the game wasn't hitting its stride. He told the team to try and find the fun in their game and checked in on them every 3 months. Over time, the game took on a more lighthearted tone similar to Mario Kart, and a 97 preview from N64.com said it was over half complete, believing it'd be released later that year. However, after 9 months of progress, Miyamoto wasn't seeing any finished game coming out of it. He assigned the studio onto a fantasy golfing game, which also never saw release. Not all was lost for Buggy Boogie, however, as some of its assets were repurposed for the 64DD title Mario Artist Polygon, specifically the game's Jiken World segment. Developed by Seta, Rev Limit made its debut at Space World 96. The game had a mixed reception from journalists who praised its visuals, but not its gameplay, citing it as somewhat slow. The game was slated for release in the first quarter of 97, though it was later pushed back to 98. Rev Limit was a no-show at that year's E3, and when IGN reached out to Seta, they said it was going through some retooling. In 99, Rev Limit made the jump to the disk drive and would make use of the system's online capabilities. Unfortunately, Seta ran into financial troubles around this time, and the game was soon cancelled. Come 2016, a pre-production cart of the game cropped up at a Yahoo auctions lot in Japan, with the build being from 99. The cartridge was discovered and purchased by the Japanese user Retro Game TV, who later uploaded footage of it to their YouTube channel. With the release of the original Hydro Thunder on N64, Midway had plans for a Hydro Thunder 2. Although it was scrapped, the game received a spiritual successor in 2009. This was H2 Overdrive, developed by Raw Thrills, a team featuring devs from the original Hydro Thunder. In 2010, a proper sequel was released on Xbox Live Arcade titled Hydro Thunder Hurricane. Another racing title on N64 was Beetle Adventure Racing. The game received near universal acclaim from fans and reviewers alike, so it seemed likely there'd be a sequel. Developers at Paradigm never released another installment, and it wasn't until 2013 where it was discovered a sequel was in the works at some point. The name of the game showed up on a developer's resume, citing the game as an N64 title slated for release in 2000. F1 World Grand Prix 3 appeared on the same resume. Given the info on the resume, it seems the game would have been a spruced-up iteration of F1 World Grand Prix 2, but it never came to be. A racing game called VRS was in the works under developer Marigal and would have taken advantage of the N64 microphone, used with games such as Hey You Pikachu. Players would give out voice commands to control their driving, though nothing else was shared about the title. Studio Japan System Supply had a racer in the works called Cavalry Battle 3000. The title would have been somewhat similar to Road Rash, but all there is to go on is a single screenshot and a brief description of the game. While there were plenty of racing titles on N64, one genre that seemed underutilized was the sports genre. Acclaimed Sports Soccer, also titled Ultra Soccer, was in the works at Probe Entertainment. The game was conceived in 1996 with a 98 release as the target, but the game was pushed back to 99. Strong competition from EA and Konami's own soccer games had the team worried, so they decided to redo their game from the ground up. Given this was their second time delaying the game, things looked grim. An acclaimed press release from April 99 said the game would be playable at E3 with a full release later that August, but these plans fell through and it was ultimately shelved. The unreleased title Hockeydrome was announced in a European magazine in March of 95 and was set to be published by Activision. The game was allegedly shown at CES 95 and was also planned for a release on PS1 and the Sega 32X. Given the title, we can only assume it would have been a hockey game. Surf Assault is a scrapped arcade surfing game from Looking Glass that used the water physics engine seen in Wild Waters. The game's cast was made up of anthropomorphic characters to separate it from the other surfing games of the era, and was said to be similar in tone to Mario Kart. The story centered on a surfing contest taking place in outer space. Jetball was was made by British studio Codemasters and was said to be similar to Pong with a futuristic flair. The game emerged from a batch of concepts made by a 6-man team that had worked on Micro Machine 64. Another concept from this batch was a mini-golf game called Birdie. Both titles were made for the N64, but never made it out of the conception stage. UEFA Euro 98 was being developed by Power and Magic, but it didn't get far in development. The game is a bit of an outlier, as from 1996 to 2016, a UEFA soccer title was released every 2 years, with the 98 game being the only omission. Development was apparently taking too long to meet the deadline, and the game was scrapped. Acclaim's Austin-based studio, then known as Iguana Entertainment, had a sports game in the works called Sports Immortal. It's not known when it was set for release, believed to have been sometime between 97 to 99. The game's designer shared a design doc giving an overview of the game. It was described as a futuristic sports title, a concept that came from another canceled game from the studio called Immortal Hockey. The goal was to score as many points as possible, being done humanely or otherwise. Goals had a power zone where if the player pulled off a power shot, it had a payoff reminiscent of the NBA Jam games. The game never got the green light, and the team went on to make other titles like Turok 64 and Iggy's Wreckin' Balls. Deer Hunter 64 was an entry in the Deer Hunter series. Basically, no information about the game exists aside from the name and the publisher being Microware Systems Corporation. Taking another peek at developer Looking Glass, the company were also working on a sports title called Warball. It was a dodgeball title where different dodgeballs had different attributes. One of the developers, Dan Matansky, had done some initial concept work and recalls how the game kept getting pushed back to the point where the team just lost interest and shelved it for good. Another genre that went somewhat underutilized on the N64 was the fighting genre, with several canceled titles under its belt. Developer Ocean Software had made several attempts at making a game based off the DC Comics character Lobo. A fighting game was planned as far back as '92 for the Commodore A1200, and later for consoles such as the SNES, Genesis, and the Atari Jaguar. However, nothing ever released, with game previews citing it as a buggy mess. In issue 33 of French magazine Superpower, Ocean mentioned plans of creating a Lobo game for the Ultra 64. Because of their history of trying to make a Lobo fighting game, it's assumed this N64 game was also planned to be some sort of fighter. This game never materialized in any form. In development at Bottom Up, Toon Panic was a fighting game with a similar setup to brawlers like Rakugaki Showtime, or the more well-known Power Stone. It never saw release due to Bottom Up going under and filing for bankruptcy. In 2005, an unfinished build of the game was sold via cartridge through Yahoo Japan's auction site for $3,500. On December 3, 2008, the prototype was released to the public via Team Carrot. The build's copyright date is listed as the year 2000, and within its files are a number of placeholder graphics. Some of these graphics hail from Final Fantasy VIII, and within the ROM is a drawing of Mario's head. It's really not clear as to why these are here, but they could have been used to test the game in its early stages. Bottom Up had another fighter in the works before they closed their doors, being Chanbara Fighter, Master of Puppets. This title was announced in '99 and scheduled for a Japan-only release on December 17th that same year. The game's roster had a marionette appearance, with strings attached to their limbs. The term Chanbara roughly translates to sword fighting, with each character having their own sword-like weapon. A chef fighter named Coronet would wield a frying pan, and an old man called Bagasm fought with a pipe. There was even a story in place, with rumors of the land of Pastelpoo's princess being kidnapped, sending 6 brave souls into action to save her. The game was set up as a one-on-one fighter, with players controlling characters with the D-pad and attacks being assigned to the C buttons or the analog stick. For one reason or another, Chanbara was cancelled. Forever Dragons was being developed by Software Creations, with designer and producer Hayden Dalton at the lead. In more recent times, Dalton is known for his work as lead designer on the first 2 Darksiders games. The game's stages were planned to have several layers, as opposed to the singular layer seen in fighters like Street Fighter, and the stages also had destructible elements. They also wanted the roster to be customizable, with players able to upgrade their abilities and swap characters with other players. A number of moves had been motion captured by the team, and a lot of time was put into making the game work fully. According to Dalton's LinkedIn page, however, the title was cancelled by around '97. An entry for Hiryu no Ken, or Fist of the Flying Dragon series, was once being made for the disk drive. There were apparently 2 versions lined up for the DD, being a real and SD version. SD refers to super deformed or chibi style for the game, which was first seen in an entry for the Super Nintendo in '94 called SD Hiryu no Ken. It's possible this was related to the previous title released on the base N64, but this game was never released. Another cancelled fighter was Raze, by developer Interplay. Previously going under the name Realms of Valor, it was a fighter with the Dungeons & Dragons license, taking place in the Forgotten Realms universe universe. IGN's N64.com detailed how Interplay played with ambitious ideas for the game's multiplayer, citing 2-on-2 fights and team battles as some of the possible modes. Beyond fighters, hack-and-slash games were also a rare commodity on the system, with a confirmed case of at least one getting the axe. In development around 1997, Dragon Sword originally went under the name Dragon Storm and was in the works at Interactive Studios by the dedicated Team Storm. The game had 20 different levels spread across 5 worlds, and over 40 weapons to choose from. It also featured co-op missions and a 4-player deathmatch mode. The plan was to have it come out first on N64, with a PC release planned 6 months later. It was practically complete, if a review from 64 Magazine is any indication. In it, the outlet gave the game a rating of 93%, lamenting the fact it wouldn't see the light of day. They even asked readers to write about their desire to see it released on an attached form. If enough were sent back, the magazine would send them off to publisher MGM in hopes they'd consider. Though these attempts were unsuccessful, a playable beta surfaced online in April 2010 thanks to an anonymous collector. In January of 2019, Pico Interactive shared the news they had obtained the rights and source code to the game with the hope of bringing it back from the grave. They previously restored the N64 port of 40 Winks after a successful Kickstarter campaign, but Dragon Sword currently remains missing in action. In terms of shoot-'em-up games, there were a few for the 64 that ended up being shot down. One of them was Viewpoint 2064, which was described as a mix of the earlier Viewpoint games and Star Fox 64. Developer Samico was in talks with a few studios for a worldwide release. It had its first and only showing at Space World 99, with the game being cancelled not long after. It was then Viewpoint came back from the brink, with Samico planning to showcase it at the Tokyo Game Show in September 2000, aiming for release in Japan by November 24th. This would be the final update for the game before it disappeared. In 2015, a playable prototype surfaced on eBay for an asking price of $3,000. Soon after, YouTuber Rama Shatan got in contact with the buyer, who sent them a recording. Dazemon DD was an expansion to a pre-existing shoot-'em-up that exclusively released in Japan in '98. The base game's editor mode reveals there was some kind of connection between the two games planned, but not much else is known about the expansion. The pinball genre also has a few absent titles on the N64, such as Digital Eclipse's Addams Family Pinball. It was based on the real-life pinball machine, which stands as the best-selling pinball machine of all time. One of the machine's coders, Jeff Vavasauer, said the game came into existence because a home version was seen as the next logical step. The team had a model comprised of 90,000 polygons which would be scaled down appropriately for whatever console it would be ported to. It also had accurate physics, featuring a mocap system used for real pinball tables. Things were going smoothly, but in late '99, the publisher GT Interactive had second thoughts about the viability of a pinball game, and soon dropped the project. There were also plans for release on the PC and rumors of a PS1 version, but these fell through as well. No screenshots of the game exist, as it never existed in an assembled state. Another pinball title was Palladium, being developed by a small European studio called Progressive Media. They showed it off to Titus at the European Computer Trade Show in '99, but the publisher passed on it. The team tried their hand at the title once more, planning to release it on the Game Boy Advance, but again failed to find a publisher. There were a few N64 puzzle games that never saw the light of day either. Like Thunder Go was a puzzle game by Togoyo Inc., based on the Chinese board game Go. It first appeared in issue 41 of Edge magazine on a list of upcoming N64 games for Japan, with a planned release date of January '97. A single screenshot of the title was shown in issue 90 of EGM, which came out the same year Go was planned for. Ironically, Go never got far along. The puzzle platformer Freak Boy was being developed by Zono Inc. and published by Virgin. This title was first showcased at E3 '96, originally under the name Stacker. Former VP of Design at Virgin, Julian Rignall, played an early demo and thought highly of it, even saying it was one of the greatest games ever made. Playing as the titular character, players could absorb 3 artifacts at a time to make up Freak Boy's head, chest, and feet, having a variety of abilities to play around with. An excerpt from GamePro had Freak Boy listed for a first quarter '97 release, but this was later pushed to late '98. The game went through a number of changes at the request of Virgin, being reworked from the ground up twice during development. By 1998, the game was put on indefinite hold and was never picked up again. Rignall told IGN, "It was a combination of idiots, morons, and stupid management decisions. revisions. Development dragged on for years and it just never got anywhere. By the time it kind of reached a point where the game was playable, the code was so unstable and badly put together they couldn't actually build a game out of it. Years later, in September 2015, a reader of Unseen 64 had stumbled across a working prototype of Freak Boy at a car boot sale. The anonymous reader bought the cart and later uploaded snippets of early alpha footage for the world to see. Another canned puzzle title came from an unexpected franchise. Dragon Ball Z Block Butoden was in the works for N64, apparently being made by Seta Corporation. Given that Seta almost exclusively make puzzle games, coupled with the word block in the title, it's likely this would have been a puzzle game with a Dragon Ball flair. Aside from the name appearing on an advertisement for the 64DD, no info about this game is known. A few strategy games never got their time to shine on the system, such as another title by Seta that was shown at Space World 1999. Gendai Dai Senryaku Ultimate War was another entry in the War Sim series Daisen Ryaku, and would have supported the 64DD's RANNet online service, where up to 4 players could connect. It went through a few changes, but the game was scheduled for a spring 2000 release. By August that same year, Seta announced the game would revert back to the base model N64, with a playable showing at that year's Space World event. This version didn't get released either. Another RTS was Clever Trick's Echo Delta, revealed at Space World 2000. As an RTS game with RPG and action elements taking place underwater, the main goal was raising your ship to the surface by finding resources on the sea bottom. Players had an 18-minute time limit to accomplish this, with finding resources helping your submarine survive longer alongside weapon upgrades. IGN had the chance to play a preview of the game, and were told it was 90% complete and scheduled for a December 2000 release in Japan. They were unsure about an international release, but believed it wouldn't be out of the question as most of the game's text was written in English. Still, nothing ever arose in any region. There's also plenty of N64 games from somewhat niche genres that were scrapped. Wet Corpse was a survival horror title in the works at Vic Tokai, and allegedly took a page out of Resident Evil's book. Few story details are known, but upon starting the game, the player would already be dead. The game was also being developed for the Sega Saturn, but both versions ended up getting cancelled, with nothing to show for it. Hasire Noku no Uma, or Run, My Horse, was an animal simulation game being made by Culture Brain. Aside from it potentially being some sort of pet game or horse racing sim, no further information exists. Carnivale was in development at Terraglyph Interactive, and was based on the 1999 film of the same name. Described by IGN as an odd circus-style platform game, it was first announced at E3 99. Vatical Entertainment told IGN in September 2000 it would see a release on December 5th that year, but the date came and went with no sign of Carnivale. On February 8, 2001, Vatical announced the game would likely never come out on the console. Terraglyph had recently laid off several team members, leaving the game in an unfinished state. Vatical claimed the game was around 50 to 60% finished, and at the time were unsure whether to pass the project over to another developer or simply can the game. Ultimately, they chose the latter option. The game Derby Day was a visual novel developed by both Aquamarine and Chunsoft, led by Chunsoft's founder Koichi Nakamura. Derby Day was believed to come out before the end of 1999, but not much else is known about the title, or why it was cancelled. Developed by Lobotomy Studios, Caesar's Palace 64 was a gambling title based on the real-world casino of the same name. The game featured a fully 3D rendition of the building with multiple floors and a variety of rooms. To work around the lack of voiceover, the game's designers came up with an animation system that gave the models a large amount of facial expressions, which had sites like IGN rather impressed. It was planned for a summer 99 release, specifically August 2nd, and carried an M rating. It was cancelled for unknown reasons. Redemption was a 3D adventure game that combined puzzle and platform elements from multiple viewpoints in an open-world fashion. Being developed by Cranberry Source, the game first made the rounds in '96 in several magazines. Redemption was one of 3 projects the studio were working on at the time, and studio co-founder John Rittman touted it as their magnum opus. In April '98, Rittman and other Cranberry staff were hired by Argonaut Games, which likely contributed to Redemption being shelved. There's also 2 Nintendo 64 games where their genre, among other things, is completely unknown. Developed by Lobotomy Software, Aquario was the studio's first project for the N64. When the company was acquired by Crave, the studio was renamed to Lobotomy Studios, and they were put to work on the aforementioned Caesar's Palace 64. Nothing further came from Aquaria. And from GameTech, there was a game called Crazy Cajun Carl. One of the game's artists shared work she had done on the game through her website, showcasing several characters and 3D models.
The Harry Potter franchise became nothing short of a global phenomenon in the 2000s, fueled in no small part by the success of its film adaptations. The Boy Who Lived soon became a household name, and the series would go on to gross many billions of dollars, launching various spin-offs and adaptations. There was a time, however, that another very different vision for the Potter media empire was on the table. In the late 90s, it was none other than Japanese video game giant Nintendo that had their eyes on the Harry Potter rights, with aspirations of transforming it into a video game series. I spoke to former Nintendo employees to discover how the company once tried to buy their way into the world of Harry Potter. Nintendo's fascination with the Harry Potter series began in around 1999. At this point in their history, the company had not long since dabbled in developing an exclusive game for their system using a license acquired from an external source. This arrangement was the foundation for 1997's GoldenEye 007 on Nintendo 64, Rare's acclaimed first-person shooter using the James Bond license. It was a break from tradition for Nintendo, who had previously made a point to cultivate their own intellectual property. The success of GoldenEye, former developers say, opened Nintendo's eyes to the potential of such collaborations and paved the way to them taking an interest in Harry Potter. The push within the wider company to look into buying the Harry Potter license is said to have originated from Nintendo of America. The idea was first being floated by Nintendo of America's management, which at the time was being run by Minoru Arakawa. Despite their Japanese headquarters ultimately having the final say on any major business decisions, Nintendo afforded some autonomy to their American branch, and this allowed them to pursue the Harry Potter IP when the opportunity presented itself. By 1999, J.K. Rowling's series had reached its third installment, and its popularity was starting to erupt. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban became one of the fastest selling books of its time after its UK debut in July of that year, and the business world was starting to take notice. With the property's immediate potential for merchandising and adaptations becoming increasingly evident, J.K. Rowling opened a dialogue to auction off the rights to use Harry Potter in other mediums. The author is said to have been interested mostly in having movie adaptations of a series made, but that didn't stop Nintendo from making an offer of their own. They too had identified the burgeoning franchise as a potential moneymaker and wanted in. The group charged with the task of coming up with ideas for Nintendo-made Harry Potter games was Nintendo Software Technology. This studio, located just down the street from Nintendo of America's HQ in Redmond, Washington, had been founded only 1 year prior with the objective of developing titles specifically for the Western market. A former Nintendo producer shared that they received strict instructions to read every Harry Potter book on the market from cover to cover in preparation. This totaled over 700 pages worth of reading material to catch up on within a few days. Nintendo Software Technology at the time was already midway into development on 3 other games: Ridge Racer 64, Bionic Commando, and a Game Boy Color version of Crystalis. A portion of developers from these projects were split into 2 groups to work on the big Harry Potter pitch. One of these would formulate ideas for a third-person adventure game that would adapt the main story of the books. The other had to create a concept for a spin-off video game based around Harry Potter's fictional sport, Quidditch. Both of these would have been developed for the Nintendo 64, with the possibility for releases on other Nintendo platforms in the future. Nintendo wanted exclusive access to the video game rights, meaning that their platforms would be the only places to find Harry Potter games. As the book series would continue, each future Nintendo system going forward would have theoretically had its own Harry Potter games based around each book, developed by Nintendo's own teams, or so was the plan. Developers described the process of mapping out the pitches as what was a hectic week of experimentation and occasional disagreements about their direction. Initially, some of the artists visualizing the world and characters of Harry Potter had planned to pursue an art direction similar to the cover art of the books. This was in response to comments J.K. Rowling had made in the press about wanting to preserve the Britishness of the books in any adaptations of the source material going forward. There was therefore an effort among artists on the project not to stray too far from the first book's art design, as envisioned by British illustrator Thomas Taylor. However, this soon received some pushback from the management of NST, who wanted the characters to be drawn in more of a manga-inspired style. After some heated debate over this, the artists eventually agreed to redraw the characters as instructed with a decidedly more Japanese look. Nintendo Software Technology didn't produce a full prototype for their Harry Potter concepts. Instead, art animations and mock 3D demos were created to show what the games might one day look like. Very few of the pitch documents have since been preserved. Among the few that have survived are some concept art pieces showing Nintendo's vision for the Harry Potter world. One locale paid particular attention to was Hogwarts itself. In one Nintendo artist's interpretation of the iconic setting, the castle was imagined as sitting on a mountaintop above a long and winding road surrounded by forests. Despite Nintendo's lofty ambitions of a long-lasting partnership with the rights holders and a line of exclusive games, their attempt to gain access to Harry Potter was ultimately unsuccessful. According to former members of the team, representatives of J.K. Rowling weren't interested in their proposal. One ex-producer recalls that Nintendo found their asking price for the license to be simply too expensive, although some sources from the company suggest that Nintendo made further moves to pursue Harry Potter only a year later. Following the rejection of Nintendo's first pitch, J.K. Rowling sold the Harry Potter movie rights in 1999. Various media companies had approached her with offers, including Universal and 20th Century Fox, but it was Warner Bros. With whom she was able to reach an agreement. A film adaptation of the first book was soon put into pre-production, scheduled for a 2001 release. In 2000, the rights to do a video game to tie into the movie were put up for sale. A number of big game industry names again came forward, such as Microsoft and Nintendo. The Big N entered discussions to develop the adaptations for their systems, and again was outdone, this time by Electronic Arts. With both Microsoft and Nintendo wanting to develop the Harry Potter games exclusively for their respective machines, the rights holders went with Electronic Arts in order to reach the widest audience possible. EA was able to develop their adaptations of the Philosopher's Stone movie for as many platforms as they desired. In its initial 2001 release, it came to Microsoft Windows, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and PlayStation. Notably, the platform that Nintendo had most wanted a Harry Potter game on, the Nintendo 64, was excluded. Following the success of the first game, EA continued to partner with Warner for the remainder of the movie series, producing adaptations of each film up until Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 in 2011. DC Comics superheroes have a long lineage in the medium of video games, with some adaptations like the Batman Arkham series proving hugely popular. For some members of the DC library, on the other hand, success has eluded them. In the case of Green Lantern, it wasn't until 2011 that the character finally received their own video game. This came in the form of Green Lantern Rise of the Manhunters, a tie-in to the Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds. This beat 'em up by Double Helix Entertainment, which was built from the remnants of a cancelled Justice League fighting game, underperformed much like the movie that inspired it. That was by no means the first attempt to translate the character into video game form, however. That honour belonged to the once prominent UK developer Ocean Software, who was producing a Green Lantern game for the SNES in the early 1990s. For decades, the unreleased project has remained largely shrouded in mystery, with memories of it being kept alive by archived magazine scans and enthusiast websites picking up the pieces. Thanks to the tireless efforts of game historians, namely Frank Gasking, the creator of Games That Weren't, much of the game's history has at last been demystified. In 2019, Frank's search to preserve Ocean's Lost project bore fruit as he recovered a prototype cartridge from the project. As a result of this discovery, in partnership with Games That Weren't, we can now exclusively bring you the world's first glimpse of the game in motion. In this installment of Game History Secrets, I'll be exploring the history of Ocean Software's Green Lantern and why the game never came to be. Ocean Software was a studio based in Manchester, England, founded in 1983. The company initially made its name developing clones and conversions of popular arcade games for home computers, such as Donkey Kong. It was a bit later into the decade that Ocean Star would truly rise, however, as they entered the business of licensed games. One of their breakout hits using this approach arrived in 1987. They took a chance on a little-known Hollywood script about a cybernetically altered police officer, purchasing the rights to adapt it into a video game prior to its release. RoboCop would go on to become one of the biggest movies of the year, and Ocean's gamble paid off for them hugely. They were able to get their adaptation of the movie out within the same year, allowing them to quickly recoup the relatively small amount paid for the license. The game was very well received, and the studio had a monster hit on its hands, as it dominated UK sales charts for over a year. Ocean's success opened the door to bigger, more established names. The studio partnered with Warner Bros. To produce a tie-in game to the 1989 Batman movie for home computers. Capitalizing upon hype around the film once again, the game sold well, further solidifying their strong working relationship with WB. Ocean's numerous Batman games paved the way to them gaining greater access to DC's back catalogue in the early 1990s. The company took an interest in a number of properties around this time, first Watchmen, followed by Lobo, and Green Lantern. The latter would end up becoming their focus, and by 1991, a Green Lantern game entered the preliminary stages of development at Ocean Software. At this point, it was being planned for the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST. Ideas were fluid, but cast Hal Jordan as the playable Green Lantern of choice. This sketch of the character, drawn by artist Mike Marshall, was one of the earliest examples of pen being put to paper on the project. It was created as part of an internship that Marshall had arranged at Ocean's Manchester offices. The project was worked on for no more than a few months before being put on ice. By all indications, the developers were struggling to come up with a solid design plan for the Amiga and ST platforms. It was shelved accordingly, with the intention of one day revisiting it. That day eventually arrived a couple of years later. By 1993, Ocean had pivoted to home console development and had a number of titles in the works for the SNES. Among them was a tie-in game inspired by the live-action Dennis the Menace movie, which launched just in time for the holiday season. Programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn were frequent collaborators at Ocean who had worked together on the game, and now found themselves in search of their next project. They would soon be paired up again, this time for a revived Green Lantern project being overseen by Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development and resident comic book enthusiast. The company's management had made the decision to bring it back on the Super Nintendo. Its improved graphical capabilities over older hardware allowed for more creative freedom, and they had already developed technology that could be used for Green Lantern. Recycling platforming code from Dennis the Menace, Green Lantern was predominantly a side-scrolling platformer with puzzle elements. Pulling right from the comics, Green Lantern's ring could project all manner of different shapes and objects to battle enemies and aid in progression, such as a giant green anvil. Their Green Lantern of choice was again Hal Jordan, the main Green Lantern in the comics at this time. The game's plot pulled from an obscure area of the source material that had only been briefly touched upon in a 1963 story called The Green Lantern Disasters. In it, Hal Jordan travels to the distant world of Zeos, a planet of intelligent insects which is home to a grasshopper-like Green Lantern named Zax. Hal finds Zeos under the thumb of a gang of bugs which has seized the planet's food supply of sugar and helps Zax defeat them. While Zax would go on to very occasionally appear in other Green Lantern media, this was, prior to 1993, the only instance in which his homeworld Zeos was shown. Regardless, it was this little-known corner of the DC universe around which Ocean decided to base their game's story. In the Green Lantern game, the Queen of Zeos threatens the fate of the universe when she sends her army of insectoid creatures to obtain a series of mythical crystals. If she is successful, the artifacts will grant them invincibility, allowing them to rule over existence unchallenged. The Green Lantern sets out to stop her, traversing various alien worlds on his way to Zeos itself to defeat her. The Zeos Queen is said to have been a fully original character that was inspired by the Queen from the 1986 sci-fi movie Aliens. The game was planned to transition between different genres of gameplay, mixing platforming levels with vertical and horizontal shoot-'em-up stages, in addition to sections which leveraged the system's Mode 7 capabilities. In these parts, players would maneuver the hero as he flies over a moonscape environment, evading and returning fire in forward-facing aerial combat. Its variety was a result of the disjointed manner in which the game was built. Separate small groups of people throughout Ocean's offices made each section individually before connecting them later in development. This slapdash approach was typical for the company at the time. Their games often followed only a loose outline, being formed in different groups and pieced together later on. It was this approach that some commentators believe was to the project's detriment and contributed to it never seeing the light of day.
The reason why it fell apart, I mean, it was because of the mismanagement. There was no clear plan, I'd say, from the start. I think in the old days of Ocean, they kind of had that winging it mentality where they'd chuck stuff together. They used to put games together in like 2 or 3 weeks sometimes if there was a Christmas deadline. But on the smaller platforms, you could get away with that. But I think as you got onto platforms, 16-bit platforms, it was much harder to do. And Green Lantern didn't really have a clear game design document. There wasn't a clear plan they were following. They were making it up. And I think that caused problems because they were chucking stuff in which didn't really fit.
For the time being, the game chugged along regardless into 1994, when, early into the year, it was disrupted by some big changes being made to the property at DC. The comic book giant had observed a slump in sales of Green Lantern and began plotting out a significant shake-up in order to renew interest in the series. These plans came into play when Hal Jordan's home Coast City was eviscerated by the supervillain duo of Mongol and Cyborg Superman. Overcome by grief, Hal later attempts in vain to recreate his lost home by using his power ring, but surmises that a larger energy source will be required in order to accomplish his goal. His grief twists into madness, sending him on a rampage across the universe, slaughtering his fellow Green Lanterns along the way. He eventually arrives at the Green Lantern Corps HQ, where he wipes out all but one of the Guardians of the Universe and steals their main source of power. He emerges from the experience as the villain Parallax. Ganthert, the last surviving Guardian, travels to Earth and entrusts a ring of power to an unassuming freelance artist named Kyle Rayner. This controversial storyline, named Emerald Twilight, ran throughout the first months of 1994. It turned the star of Ocean's game from hero to villain and was plotted out entirely without their knowledge. This meant that the team had to suddenly replace Hal Jordan with Kyle Rayner as the protagonist mid-development, a mandate handed down to them by DC with no prior warning. Parallax would later become reworked into a boss character that Kyle would have fought partway through the story. Following these changes, the title was reported to have had a small presence at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show of 1994. It also appeared in game magazines shortly thereafter. It was expected to be released in late 1994, according to the information supplied to these outlets. For this brief space of time, development was seemingly going smoothly, but as the year went on, the game's fate was cast into uncertainty. In mid-1994, Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development, resigned from the company amid rumours of a possible takeover. Fearing a change in Ocean's workplace culture, he left before Green Lantern was completed. Over the years, many have given credit to Bracey's leadership as a key factor in Ocean's success. His departure set the stage for some of the difficulties that would follow. Green Lantern's SNES game was, according to former Ocean staff, finished on schedule by late 1994. A soundtrack had been recorded in full by Dean Evans, the studio's resident composer, and a bombastic conclusion to the story had been mapped out. Players would have infiltrated the outer rim of Zeos in an R-Type-esque horizontal shooting section before descending beneath the planet's surface to eventually confront the Queen in a final boss sequence. The game was awaiting testing when it was rocked once more by external forces. In September of that year, DC kicked off another world-altering event that was heavily based around the Green Lantern characters. 0 Hour Crisis in Time was a massive crossover storyline which had major implications for the entire DC universe. Hal Jordan, aka Parallax, used his newfound powers to reset the universe from scratch in the hopes of restoring Coast City and those who had perished. DC used this premise to wipe the slate clean, undoing certain past events and laying the groundwork for the future. This was another major development in the comic books that licensees Ocean Software had no prior knowledge of, but one which they would have to quickly adapt to in order for their game to see the light of day. DC instructed them that the game would need to be reworked to be set after the events of 0 Hour. This meant removing and/or changing characters from the previous version of the DC universe, such as Parallax. The changes needed to get it up to code were apparently significant, and Ocean Software's remaining management weren't keen to implement them. Despite it being very close to the finish line, a decent investment was still required to give it the refresh it needed. By late 1994, Ocean had concerns that the Super Nintendo's expiration date was drawing near. Weighing this up with the costs of revamping the game led them to shelving the project. Within a short space of time, the Green Lantern video game had gone from briefly being considered content complete to outright cancelled. The decision was made as part of a shift in priorities for Ocean Software, whose management was intending to phase out the development of 2D games and focus on 3D ones. This was met with some dissent from two key employees, programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn. As Frank Gasking explains, this creative disagreement quickly escalated with severe consequences.
Ivan and Andrew weren't particularly happy about that. They kind of voiced their concerns about it. It wasn't a great idea, and then the next thing they know, they're basically let go. They no longer have jobs, so they're gone essentially, and that they were completely shocked by that. So by the sounds of it, they took their code with them. They didn't actually leave any remains of it at Ocean.
For a few weeks, the fate of Ocean's Green Lantern appeared to be resolved, when, against the odds, the company chose to revive it. Bobby Earl, a programmer at the studio, had requested additional work hours in order to fund a mortgage deposit on a new house. After weighing up their options, Ocean went back on their previous call and placed him in charge of revamping their Green Lantern SNES game. Earl spent his usual hours at Ocean developing Silver, an RPG for PC. When the working day ended for most other employees, he switched over to Green Lantern. As the lone programmer on the project, and Andrew Deacon's code effectively gone, Earl had to rebuild much of the game himself. But there were still plenty of assets from the previous iteration he had access to. Large swaths of the art were reused, such as backgrounds, and the musical score from Dean Evans was brought back too. This new version of the project, seen here in motion for the first time, was built using the engine from Ocean's Jurassic Park 2 game. This side-scrolling shooter was a fresh take on the property that endeavoured to be more faithful to the comic books in the hopes of appeasing DC's higher-ups. The game's planned opening is particularly indicative of this approach. The team constructed a highly detailed cutscene which painstakingly recreated a sequence from the comics in which Kyle Rayner first gained possession of his ring. The dialogue is lifted off the page almost verbatim, a sign of their renewed commitment to the source material. Gone was the original story of Zeos and its power-hungry queen, replaced with an attempt to more directly adapt Rayner's origins into video game form. The first level would have seen him navigating a particularly dangerous Los Angeles street, blasting gun-toting thugs with his ring. As opposed to generating a series of different shapes with the ring, as you did in the previous version, the game simplified its functionality to a projectile weapon. It could be upgraded into a series of increasingly more devastating green firearms, such as a rocket launcher via power-ups. After making his way through the mean streets, the Green Lantern was intended to come up against a first boss. This was based around the first villain Kyle encounters in the comics, an unnamed man in a mech suit who is wreaking havoc and attempting to siphon off the city's power supply. The boss battle was seemingly never finished. This third iteration of the project dispensed with the shoot 'em up levels and Mode 7 stages and chose to focus on making a side-scrolling shooter with elements of platforming. Some other variety sections were planned, but the specifics of them were yet to be determined. For a few months, a skeleton team tinkered away on the project in around late 1994 through into 95. This consisted primarily of Bobby Earl and a few artists including John Ritzer and Ray Coffey. This small group allowed Ocean to redo Green Lantern according to DC specifications with less of a financial commitment, and having Bobby Earl develop it outside of work hours meant that resources were less impacted. These positives, however, couldn't ultimately offset the concerns that Ocean's higher-ups had held previously. The Super Nintendo was well into its twilight years by this point, and the company's trepidations about releasing new games on it were only growing. With the PlayStation set to arrive in the West later that year, and Nintendo's home console also looming, time was running out for Ocean's Green Lantern on the SNES. Realizing the potential for diminished sales, Ocean finally pulled the plug on the project for good. John Lomax, an artist who briefly worked on Green Lantern, put it thusly. Ocean decided it wouldn't make enough additional revenue above their marketing and development costs to continue any further. The reboot of the project just compounded the problem. Former employees indicate that the game still had a decent amount of development time ahead of it. A few different levels were mapped out, but remained largely incomplete. The game would have eventually portrayed different worlds beyond Earth, including one crawling with alien mercenaries. Some of the music written for the game was re-implemented in another Ocean game, Waterworld, for the SNES. In 2011, Dean Evans posted his Green Lantern soundtrack on YouTube. The project's demise represented the beginning of the end for Ocean's relationship with DC Comics. A year after its cancellation, the company axed a fighting game based around Lobo, which was being made for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Years later, the Green Lantern game slipped into relative obscurity before Frank Gasking's research finally uncovered the truth about its development, which was first published in his book, The Games That Weren't. Frank's efforts also brought to light a prototype cartridge from the end of development, recovered from former Ocean staffer Roy Fielding in 2019. You can learn more about the Green Lantern game in the Games That Weren't book and at gamesthatweren't.com. Neversoft made a name for itself in the late 90s with their breakout hit Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. However, for a time, it was very nearly preceded by another major title that was also one set to bring them to widespread attention. This was a collaboration between them, Crystal Dynamics, and Marvel. In early 1996, then publisher Crystal Dynamics entered an agreement with Marvel to produce video games using a couple of their properties. In particular, the company was interested in making titles based around some of their darker, grittier heroes. One of these was Ghost Rider, and the developer entrusted with it was Neversoft. At the time, the team behind it was putting the finishing touches on Skeleton Warriors, a 2D platformer for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, linked with the short-lived cartoon of the same name. Their Ghost Rider project would use the same engine as that game, with some modifications. It was intended to be in the vein of Skeleton Warriors, a gothic 2D side-scroller for the PlayStation, with a few key innovations. These ideas started to steadily come together within the first months of 1996 as an early prototype was developed. It was far from finished at this point, but they had produced a proof of concept demo that was very briefly shown by Crystal Dynamics at E3 96 in May to members of the press. It was developed a bit further after E3, resulting in the build you see here. This demonstration is in no way representative of what the final game might have looked like, but it is the most complete prototype from development that's known to exist. It was obtained by the editor of PlayStation Museum years later, who allowed me to use it for the purposes of this video. The central concept of Neversoft's Ghost Rider involved a two-dimensional plane in a 3D world. The environments themselves were 3D, the character moved along a 2D plane walking either left or right, but could tilt the angle at which they were facing to navigate the 3D world, moving between the foreground and background. This could be used to, for instance, avoid enemy attacks, view hidden details in the environments, or access platforms and doors located at different degrees degrees of depth in the levels. Design documents recovered from former workers of Neversoft detail the plot which was planned for the game. Like Skeleton Warriors, it was planned to feature pre-rendered CGI cutscenes as its main storytelling device, although none of them actually made it into production over the game's somewhat short lifespan. According to internal notes, it was aiming to include voiceover of some description too. The main villain would have been the vampire goddess Lilith, who's joined by her new allies the demon Zarathos and the immortal Centurious. For years, the three of them have been confined to the shadow side, a neighbouring dimension to our own. The villainess hopes to invade our world by destroying the Circle of Baloth, a powerful amulet which maintains the magical borders between Earth and the shadow side. In the opening segment, they would have succeeded in doing so, shattering it into many pieces, causing the barriers protecting Ghost Rider's reality to weaken. Their demon army commences its invasion of Earth. Meanwhile, Zarathos and Lilith are seeking to unite the three pieces of an ancient artifact known as the Talisman of Power. If completed, it will grant the two of them omnipotence, rendering them unstoppable. The first two shards of the talisman were previously in the possessions of Johnny Blaze and Vengeance respectively, but both have been defeated and their pieces captured by the forces of evil. The remaining fragment is carried by another unnamed Ghost Rider, who is now all that stands between us and the apocalypse. The player, controlling the last Ghost Rider, must free his fallen companions, reassemble the Circle of Baloth, and defeat this alliance of evildoers. In the game, players would have recovered bits of the Circle by defeating various members of the demon army, the most faithful of which have been rewarded with a piece to protect. The story was essentially a tweaked retelling of an arc from the 90s Ghost Rider comic book run, in which the same characters attempted to gain control of a similar object called the Medallion of Power. Ghost Rider's main weapon in the video game was his iconic Hellfire chain, which could be used in a few different ways. A standard attack would whip the chain forward at enemies, or it could be waved in any direction by holding the attack button and directing it with the D-pad. He could also attach it to street lamps and other structures to swing himself about. In the final game, he would have been able to use his penance stare too. Ghost Rider's energy was represented as a fiery chain in the top left of the screen, which he could grow by killing enemies and collecting their souls. The more souls he gathered, the more deadly his Hellfire chain would become, eventually giving off particle effects like wisps of fire and smoke. The developers were giving plenty of attention to Ghost Rider's flame effects, and were making a system that would render them in real time as opposed to having a pre-rendered sprite. This would allow the fire coming from his skull and chains to react dynamically, blowing in response to wind or waning when he was weakened. In addition to the 2D side-scroller levels, it was set to feature a number of stages where Ghost Rider would have made use of his bike. These would have been similar to the 3D flying sections from Skeleton Warriors, where the player is steadily moving forward and must turn left or right to avoid obstacles and destroy enemies. However, none of the driving gameplay was ever worked on, as the game's development was cut short. Following E3 1996, it continued for a few more months before it was shut down. Crystal Dynamics, who had covered the project's costs up until that point, had decided to leave video game publishing behind to become a full-time developer. This meant that they would withdraw support from their Marvel projects, including Ghost Rider. Without a publisher, Neversoft was left with no choice but to shelve it. According to one former associate of theirs, there was briefly an effort to revive it. A pitch is said to have made it to the heads of Crystal Dynamics to potentially finance the remainder of development. It was apparently turned down due to concerns that 2D side-scrollers like Ghost Rider weren't in line with consumer interests at the time. Crystal Dynamics wanted to focus on true 3D games like Gex Enter the Gecko. Only one stage of Neversoft's Ghost Rider was ever up and running smoothly. There was planned to be 15 in total, but the rest were left in a rough, unfinished state. An ex-Neversoft employee estimates that around a third of the game was finished in the 6 or so months it was being made. Joby Otero, the project's lead artist, told me that he believed that it would have been the company's first really good game had it been finished. It would have been a PlayStation exclusive at launch, and was meant to release on a second platform at a later date, but which platform that was supposed to be was never determined. All that remains of the project today is this early exploratory demo made to test some of the team's ideas that were ultimately never given the time to be fully fleshed out.